Chapter 430. Thinking about noble consort Lu's deduction, Mo Jingqi's face became more and more gloomy. If Mo Xiaoyao really got the imperial jade seal, then would it really be the mandate of heaven? It seemed that Mo Xiaoyao really wanted to rule the world. Thinking of this, Mo Jingqi naturally couldn't sit still. He stood up and walked out. Noble consort Lu didn't stop him. She just watched him go out with an indifferent expression. Hearing the sound of the imperial carriage, the palace was silent again. You didn't mention the Su family. Tan Jiji's voice sounded in the palace. You haven't left yet. Noble consort Lu's face darkened. She said unhappily. Knowing that he wasn't welcome, Tan Jiji didn't force her. He said, I'm leaving right away. It seems that His Majesty is also interested in the imperial jade seal. Noble consort Lu snorted. You didn't tell him about the imperial jade seal. Do you think he won't suspect you when he comes back to his senses? Mo Jingqi didn't know anything else, but he was good at suspecting people. As long as there was a trace, no matter whether it was true or not, he would suspect him first. Tan Jiji said carelessly, I've been at his beck and call for 10 years. I'm tired. I'm preparing to change my identity. I'm afraid I won't have so much time to see noble consort Lu in the future. I really don't want to leave. Get out. Noble consort Lu said coldly. Tan Jiji sighed. He walked to noble consort Lu's side and lifted a strand of her hair. He said softly, Ruoyo, when we get the world in the future, I'll let you deal with Mo Xiaoyao and Yili personally. Get out. In Riyang City. Mo Xiaoyao leaned against the couch and looked at Prince De and Mo Jingyu in front of him. Last night, Suzha suddenly fell seriously ill and couldn't even get out of bed this morning. Naturally, he couldn't attend this meeting. As for Mo Jian, he seemed to have been forgotten and only sat on the side to accompany the guests. After a night, Prince De's expression became much more restrained. Mo Xiaoyao nodded secretly. This was the Prince De who had escaped unscathed from the fight for the throne. After all these years of living like a prince, she was afraid that he had forgotten the prudence of the royal family. Lowering his head to take a sip of tea, Mo Xiaoyao asked, King De and King Yu, what decree does the emperor have for I? King De and King Yu looked at each other. They could hear the ridicule in Mo Xiaoyao's words. King Yu cupped his hands and said, Prince Ding, please forgive me. Uncle and I are only here on orders to convey the emperor's intentions. Presumably, Prince already understood yesterday that His Majesty's intention is for His Majesty to immediately return to the capital. Of course, although His Majesty's order in his rage cannot be withdrawn, His Majesty will naturally return everything that belongs to Prince. King Yu didn't dare to say anything more. He only explained Mo Jingqi's intentions in full detail. He wasn't willing to say anything else. Mo Xiaoyao laughed loudly and said, I understand your Majesty's meaning. But I'm afraid it won't be as the Emperor wishes. King Yu's heart sank. Was Prince Ding determined to fall out with the Dechu state? Mo Xiaoyao raised his hand to stop him from speaking and said, King Yu, please go back and inform the Emperor that the Mahist army will remember the Emperor's previous actions. Even if I am willing to take the risk to trust the Emperor, I'm afraid the Mahist army will not agree. King Yu swallowed his saliva with difficulty and said with difficulty, the Prince Ding mansion has been loyal to the country for generations. Why is the prince so decisive? Even if there is anything you are dissatisfied with, as long as the prince says it out loud, I will definitely report it to the Emperor and discuss it again. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and said, discuss again? I appreciate King Yu's good intentions. At the same time, King Yu can also tell the Emperor and the ministers that as long as I am here, the Western Tomb will not invade the Dechu state from the northwest. King Yu felt bitter in his heart. As long as the Mahist army was in the northwest, the Western Tomb would naturally not have the chance to invade from the northwest. However, the Western Tomb and the Dechu state shared a border in the southwest. Although the journey was several times more dangerous than the one in the northwest, as long as one had the will, the Dechu state was still weak in the southwest border. It was not impossible for the Western Tomb to invade the Dechu state from the southwest. King De looked at Mo Xiaoyao and asked, Prince Ding, have you made up your mind? Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyes and smiled indifferently, I just want to give the Mahist army and their wives and children a way out. The Prince Ding mansion has defended the Dechu state for generations. Even if there is no merit, there is still hard work. I can't let the Prince Ding mansion end here from right? If that's the case, how can I face my royal father, elder brother, and the ancestors of the Prince Ding mansion in the future? King De was silent for a long time, then nodded and said, all right, I and King Yu can't persuade you. We have already passed on the Emperor's decree, so we won't say anything else. I only hope that Prince Ding will not forget that the men of the Ding mansion and the Mahist army are still citizens of the Dechu state. Mo Xiaoyao smiled without saying a word. After ordering people to send King De and King Yu back to the guest courtyard to rest, Yili walked out from behind while holding onto the girl's hand. She smiled faintly and said, after not seeing you for one night, King De has changed quite a bit. Mo Xiaoyao stood up to support her. He waved his hand to dismiss the girl and said, to be able to return safely from the hands of the previous emperor for so many years, King De is also an old fox who has cultivated to become a spirit. It's just that he's been a little too complacent these past few years. He thinks that just because Mo Jingqi calls him imperial uncle, he really respects him like an uncle. She didn't know that Mo Jingqi hated those old officials and elders who suppressed him the most. He didn't need to be instigated. As long as there was a chance, Mo Jingqi wanted to kill them. Now that he has taken out his righteous words to persuade even if I don't give him face, I still have to let them safely return to the Chu capital. Slowly sitting down, Yili recalled the performance of the two princes just now. If it was said that he was a lobbyist for Mo Jingqi, he would lack some persuasiveness. He only said what Mo Jingqi meant, and then gave Mo Xiaoyao a few sentences. It was obvious that neither of them wanted to really anger Mo Xiaoyao. Yili smiled faintly and said, you originally planned to let them go back? Mo Xiaoyao nodded slightly, sat down beside him and said, although these two people can't do much, if they just want to find trouble for Mo Jingqi, it's enough. I don't want to pay attention to them for the next few months. Lowering his head to look at Yili's round belly, he raised his hand and gently stroked it. Coincidentally, the baby in her belly kicked. Mo Xiaoyao raised his brows. Seeing Yili frown slightly, he said, this kid really doesn't know his place. He must be properly trained after he is born. Yili didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She didn't know if it was her imagination, but as long as Mo Xiaoyao was by her side, especially when she touched him, the child in her stomach would become especially lively. He said helplessly, what can a fetus know? Prince is becoming more and more childish. Mo Xiaoyao raised his sword-like eyebrows. He made up his mind that when the child was born, he would definitely teach him a good lesson. A few days later, King De and King Yu bid farewell to Mo Xiaoyao and prepared to return to the capital. However, Su Zhe was seriously ill. When King Yu personally went to take a look, Su Zhe was already skinny to the point of skin and bones, and had fallen into a coma. That appearance could not be fake no matter what. Not to mention returning to the capital, even if he did not take good care of himself, he would still be able to die from a cold. However, the two kings knew that the northwest was not a place they could stay for long. He could only bid farewell to Mo Xiaoyao and return to the capital to report to the emperor. When Su Zhe was better, he would send someone to bring him back to the capital. Mo Xiaoyao naturally wouldn't keep them. The two of them and Mo Jian didn't pursue the matter of why there were less than half of the guards left with Mo Jian and Mo Jian. They set off on the same day. Mo Xiaoyao only smiled indifferently when he heard this. He sent Zhang Yu and Lu Jingxian, who was stationed in Ruyang, to personally escort the two princes out of the city. Chapter 431. In the dim dungeon, Mo Xiaoyao sat on a chair and lazily looked at the middle-aged man who was tied to a wooden stake and covered in blood. He raised his eyebrows and smiled. Deputy Commander of the Imperial Guards? The Emperor's trusted aide and favorite general, Xue Qingliang? And, the Empress Dowager's nephew, the Emperor's cousin? Mo Jingqi is really willing to spend a lot of money to send you to the northwest? The man raised his head and looked at the man in white with white hair. His eyes flashed with a trace of panic. In a dark and dirty place like the dungeon, this kind of white color made people's heart feel even more cold. Mo Xiaoyao didn't care and smiled indifferently. I heard that Commander Shui is known as the #1 expert in the palace and your martial arts are only slightly worse than Mu Qingsang's. After so many years, you've only been a deputy commander of the Imperial Guards. It's really a waste of talent. Shui Qingliang suddenly raised his head. He didn't have any fame in the capital and had been an unremarkable deputy commander of the Imperial Guards for so many years. He didn't expect Mo Xiaoyao to have investigated him so thoroughly. Mo Xiaoyao leaned back in his chair and looked at him from the corner of his eyes. After entering my Ruyang city, Commander Shui shouldn't be thinking that you can safely leave, right? I won't let people torture you. I reckon that torture is useless to you. Do you plan to say it yourself or do you want I to think of a way to make you say it? Shui Qingliang sneered. Does Ruyang city belong to the prince? Does this world belong to the king? Does the king think that Ruyang is yours just because you've occupied it? I really didn't expect that the Ding imperial residence would produce a rebel. I don't know if Mo Lanyun and Mo Lufang will be able to face the great ancestor and the late emperor in the underworld. Mo Xiaoyao didn't care about his cursing. His eyes were as cold as snow. I didn't expect Commander Shui to be such a loyal and patriotic person. I really admire him. However, I don't know if Commander Shui's confidant and the young master who was born not long ago are also loyal and patriotic people. Shui Qingliang was stunned and a trace of panic appeared in his eyes. Only now did he truly believe that Mo Xiaoyao had investigated his identity thoroughly. If Mo Xiaoyao had used his family to threaten him, he might not have cared. However, he was the son of a concubine of the Shui family, and the head of the Shui family was the sister of the Empress Dowager. He had suffered a lot since he was young. He had no feelings for the Shui family, including his wife. But the confidant and newborn child mentioned by Mo Xiaoyao were indeed his favorite. She was his childhood sweetheart, the first woman he loved in this life. She had accompanied him through the most difficult times of those years, and now they had a son. Originally, he had already planned to ask the emperor for an imperial decree after returning home, so that he could openly welcome her and their child back home as his wives. Seeing Shui Qingliang's expression change, Mo Xiaoyao smiled in satisfaction and raised his hand to move his fingers. Behind him, Qin Feng took out a portrait and unfolded it before handing it to Shui Qingliang. Shui Qingliang's originally green face immediately paled. The people in the portrait were his sweetheart and his son. Not to mention their appearance, even the courtyard in the background was exactly the same. Shui Qingliang exclaimed in shock, "That's impossible. How could you?" Mo Xiaoyao's smile was cold and emotionless. I truly didn't know that Commander Shui would grace the Northwest with his presence. But I never said that I would never return to the Chu capital. Since that's the case, we naturally need to properly investigate what kind of people are at His Majesty's side. Ever since the incident with Tan Jiji, Mo Xiaoyao had ordered Tianyi Pavilion and the Shadow Guard to thoroughly investigate Mo Jingqi's side. Although they couldn't be certain that they had uncovered all of Mo Jingqi's hidden pawns, they had still gained some results. "What do you want?" Shui Qingliang asked in a hoarse voice. Mo Xiaoyao stood up and said, "Commander Shui has been at His Majesty's side since he was 15, so you must know a lot. Don't worry, you can slowly think about it. In less than a month, I guarantee that Commander Shui's family will be reunited. At that time, it won't be too late for Commander Shui to slowly consider what answer to give." After saying this, Mo Xiaoyao no longer paid any attention to Shui Qingliang, who was tied to a pillar and covered in blood. He turned and walked out of the prison cell. Behind him, Shui Qingliang roared angrily, "Mo Xiaoyao, you're not allowed to hurt them." "Oh right, Commander Shui, please don't think of committing suicide or anything stupid. I don't have a rule of not killing women and children, or do you want your son to suffer in your place? Mo Xiaoyao, you'll die a horrible death." Shui Qingliang looked at the man in front of him with white robes and hair as white as snow. as if he was looking at a demon or a ghost. Die a horrible death? Mo Xiaoyao snorted, I have already died more than 10 times. I may not be afraid of death, but Commander Shui, are you afraid? Shui Qingliang was speechless. Was he afraid of death? Of course he was. He had suffered countless hardships since he was young, and now that he finally had his own family and his own child, how could he not be afraid of death? Su Zhe woke up 5 days after De Wang and Yu Wang left. Hearing Mo Xiaoyao say that the second king had already left with his men, Su Zhe was stunned for a moment. He looked at Mo Xiaoyao and shook his head, why is your highness doing this? Mo Xiaoyao was silent for a moment before saying, Elder Su's body can no longer withstand the long journey. If Elder Su insists on returning, he will have to wait until his body fully recovers. If Elder Su does not wish to live in Ruyang City, there is a courtyard outside the city for Elder Su to stay temporarily. Su Zhe sighed, shook his head, and did not say anything more. He only lived alone in the quiet courtyard of the prince's mansion to recuperate. He read books and rarely left the house. He also did not ask about Su Zuidi's matters. When the child was 9 months old, a piece of news suddenly spread throughout the various countries. It was said that the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu's treasure and the imperial jade seal were in the northwest. The previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu was considered to be an even more legendary figure than the Dechu state's great ancestor. It was said that he had once obtained the Golden City's treasure, which was only recorded in unofficial history. It was said that it was a city built with gold. It could be imagined how rich the Emperor Gaozu's family was if this rumor was true. Not to mention the imperial jade seal that caused the nobles of the various countries to scramble for it. As soon as this news came out, there were immediately signs of various people moving about in the northwest, causing the originally calm situation in the northwest to immediately become tense. Yi Li's belly was getting bigger and bigger. After 9 months, the child could be born at any time. Mo Xiaoyao had already sent people to choose servants and midwives to stay in the mansion at any time. Not only that, but because Yi Li had always disliked other people serving her, Mo Xiaoyao specially sent people to bring over the people by Yi Li's side that were originally in the Chu capital. Seeing that Chief Steward Mo had been transferred to the northwest, leaving the Central Plains affairs unattended, Feng Zhiao repeatedly cursed and sent a letter to Leng Haoyu to have him temporarily take over the Central Plains affairs. Qin Feng, who went to pick up the people, arrived in Ruyang City at almost the same time as the news of the previous dynasty's treasure. Mo Xiaoyao, who had originally been accompanying Yi Li to relax, received the news from Zhuojing. His expression darkened and he coldly said, Tan Jiji, you really are in a hurry to die. Yi Li took the letter and glanced at it. She nudged Mo Xiaoyao and said, hurry and go take care of it. Feng San and the others are definitely waiting. Mo Xiaoyao sighed softly and gently said, I'll be right back. You don't have to worry too much. Yi Li smiled and nodded. She watched as Mo Xiaoyao left. Only then did she turn around to look at the people at the side and said with a faint smile, Nanny, Mother Lin, are you all well? Chapter 432. The two mamas were already in tears. If it wasn't for the fact that Mo Xiaoyao had been present, they would have already thrown themselves in front of Yi Li and cried. Miss Wang Fei, we old servants thought we would never see you again. Qing Shuang and the others also crowded around Yi Li, crying and laughing as they spoke. For a moment, the room was very lively. Yi Li smiled as she looked at them. In the blink of an eye, they had not seen each other for a year. Usually, she did not feel it, but now that she saw them, she realized how much she had missed them. Seeing Qing Shuang stare at her as she wiped her tears and refused to speak, Yi Li smiled and reached out to touch her pink cheeks. She smiled and said, a year, Qing Shuang has grown into a big girl. Qing Shuang's face turned red and she glared fiercely at Yi Li. She said, Miss is so cruel. You didn't come to pick up Qing Shuang for so long. Qing Shuang will ignore Miss. Yi Li apologized and said softly, silly girl, what's so good about coming to the northwest with me? Isn't it good to stay in Jing? Even though Mo Jingqi had given the order to strip Mo Xiaoyao of his title, he still did not dare to openly seize the Prince Ding mansion. But for safety, Chief Steward Mo still moved the important things in the mansion. Of course, this included the important people in the mansion. These girls had the protection of the shadow guard of the Prince Ding mansion in Jing. It was better than coming all the way to the northwest. If Mo Xiaoyao had not sent Qin Feng to pick them up, Yili had not planned to bring them to Ruyang. Mother Lin, Nanny, it's been hard on you. Looking at the slightly thin Nanny and Mother Lin, Yili felt even more guilty. Originally, the Nanny and Mother Lin had been brought to second uncle's Fu. When the situation stabilized, they would be sent back to Yunzhou. But now, she was brought to Ruyang from afar. Not only was she separated from her family, but the climate in the northwest was also not as good as the capital and Yunzhou. Wei Mama wiped her tears and joyfully examined Yi Li's abdomen. She smiled and said, "Wang Fei, what are you saying? To be able to serve Wang Fei and little Shitzi is the best. Where did the hardship come from? This year, Wang Fei, so many things have happened in Jing that we have not been able to eat or sleep well after hearing about them. It's a pity that we are so far away that we don't know anything." Lin Mama nodded her head and said, "That's right. Now that I can see Wang Fei give birth to Ping'an and the little Shitzi, this old servant will be able to answer to young miss in the future." The young miss that Lin Mama was referring to was naturally Yi Li's mother, Su Shi. Yi Li held Mother Lin's hand and said softly, "Since that's the case, I'll have to trouble Mother and wet nurse in the future. You must be tired from the long journey. Why don't you rest for a few days before we talk about other things?" Although Mother Lin and the wet nurse were reluctant to part, they were indeed not young anymore. The bumpy journey was indeed not light. They could only let the servants take them to rest. The young Yahuan also had tired expressions, but their spirits were unusually good. They surrounded Yi Li and chattered endlessly with curiosity and joy. With great difficulty, Yi Li finally managed to calm them down and let the servants take them to rest. Seeing the hall quiet down again, Yi Li smiled and said to Qin Feng, who was standing at the side, "It hasn't been so lively in a long time. I'm not used to it." Qin Feng smiled faintly and said, "Wang Fei doesn't like people to serve her, and the people by her side don't dare to disturb Wang Fei. But these girls have been with Wang Fei for a long time and are very close to Wang Fei." Yi Li nodded and changed her mind to ask about proper matters. "On the way back, did you hear any news?" Qin Feng nodded and said, "When we were close to the northwest, we did hear some rumors. But we didn't take the official roads on the way back, so there wasn't any important news. It's just that the news of the previous dynasty's treasure may have first spread from the capital, but it didn't come from the capital." Yi Li nodded. Qin Feng and the others hadn't been slow on the way back. When he left the capital, he hadn't heard the news, but when he arrived in the northwest, it had already spread to the entire world. This news naturally didn't come from the capital. There were probably people secretly spreading it everywhere. Snorting softly, Yi Li sneered and said, "The prince is right. Tan Jiji is indeed in a hurry to die." The baby in Yi Li's stomach seemed to have sensed its mother's anger. Yi Li only felt 2 kicks in her stomach. She frowned and smiled helplessly as she reached out to comfort the baby. This child was very lively even in the womb. It would definitely be a mischievous little brat in the future. Qin Feng looked awkwardly at Yi Li. He wanted to say something but stopped. Yi Li smiled at him and said, "If you have something to say, just say it. Is Commander Qin shy?" Qin Feng's handsome face reddened slightly. Yi Li smiled in surprise and said, "Could it be that I guessed correctly? Has Commander Qin encountered some luck with women this time?" Qin Feng smiled helplessly and said, "Princess, don't tease this subordinate. It's just that this subordinate saved someone on the road and brought her back to Ruyang without Princess permission." "Princess, please punish me." "Saved someone? Could it be an old acquaintance?" Yi Li asked with a raised brow. Qin Feng nodded and said, "It's Miss Yaoji." "Does Princess still remember?" Of course Yi Li remembered. Holding her stomach and sitting steadily, Yi Li asked, "What happened?" Tell me from the beginning. Only then did Qin Feng tell her everything from the beginning. It turned out that after Qin Feng picked up Director Mo's group, he took them to avoid the official roads and traveled day and night. However, they encountered Yaoji, who was being chased outside a small town more than 300 li away from the capital. It was not exactly a chase. At that time, Yaoji was fiercely protecting a child. The other party probably wanted to snatch the child. However, Yaoji resisted desperately and finally angered the other party, so they wanted to kill her and snatch the child. Qin Feng had seen Yaoji a few times. Naturally, he could not leave her in the lurch. Therefore, he defeated the group of people and rescued Yaoji. However, Yaoji's appearance was too outstanding. Now that there were wars everywhere, they had nowhere to go with a child. Therefore, Qin Feng brought her back. Yili smiled and said, "What did I do at that time? Did you send someone to investigate Yaoji?" Qin Feng nodded and said, "That day, I ordered the shadow guard to investigate. There was nothing suspicious." Yili nodded and said, "You have always been reliable. Yaoji is also an old acquaintance, so you brought her back. But have you thought about how to settle her down?" Qin Feng was a little distressed. He only cared about rescuing her. When did he think about how to settle her down? Yili covered her mouth and smiled. Yaoji must have fled in panic when being chased. Otherwise, with her ability, she would not be so embarrassed. If she had some money and property, it would be fine to find a place for her to live and make a living in the city. But look at her. When I rescued her, I saw that her clothes were old and she was thin. I am afraid she did not have much money. Qin Feng suddenly understood. He nodded and said, "Thank you for your advice, Wang Fei. I understand. I will find a place for her to settle down later. I also have some savings. There is no harm in giving her some for temporary use." Yili wished she could knock Qin Feng's wooden head. She rolled her eyes at him and said, "She is a single woman with a child. How can she accept your money? Although she used to be a prostitute, now that she has a child, how can she not consider the child? It is not easy to stay here. Naturally, she will not go back to her old job. Does she still want her reputation?" Unless Qin Feng planned to marry her, it was better not to be too solicitous. Qin Feng was a little dispirited. He looked at Yili helplessly. He could not give her money, but he also could not refuse. How could saving someone be more troublesome than going to the battlefield? Chapter 433. Yili sighed and said, "Ask Miss Yaoji to come. Maybe she already has a plan." Yaoji was not one of those girls who had no opinions. Even though they had only met a few times and Yili did not agree with some of her actions, it did not prevent her from appreciating Yaoji's uniqueness. Qin Feng sighed in relief. It was good that Wang Fei was willing to intervene. He really did not know how to deal with Yaoji. "Thank you, Wang Fei." A short while later, Yaoji was brought in by the guards outside. Seeing the thin and pale woman in front of her, Yili could not help but sigh inside. The Yaoji in front of her was like a different person compared to the sad and stubborn woman from a year ago who was still radiant. The originally delicate face and snow-white skin appeared thin and sallow due to the adverse effects for a long time. One could only vaguely see the former beauty from the beautiful outline. Her beautiful hair was only casually tied with a cloth, and the yellow and dry hair hung down behind her back. Yaoji was holding a swaddling cloth in her hands. The child looked well taken care of. It was about 5 or 6 months old. She waved her hand to indicate Qin Feng to leave first. Qin Feng looked hesitantly at Yaoji and frowned slightly. Even though the matter of Yaoji had been investigated, Wang Fei was now at a very critical time. There could not be any mistakes. Thinking of this, Qin Feng regretted disturbing Wang Fei with this matter at this time. He only thought that he had to report to Wang Fei that he had rescued Yaoji without permission and brought her back. But he forgot that Wang Fei was about to give birth. As long as nothing happened to Yaoji, it was okay to report later. Seeing Qin Feng hesitate, Yili smiled faintly and said, "You go out first. I want to talk to Miss Yaoji." Qin Feng could only retreat outside the door and wait. Yili smiled apologetically at Yaoji and said, "Sorry for the embarrassment." Yaoji shook her head and smiled faintly. Qin Darren is so loyal to Wang Fei, it really makes one envious. Yili looked at the child in Yaoji's arms. From time to time, Yaoji lowered her head to look at him and rocked gently. Her sickly face was full of love. This child. Yaoji held the child tightly in her arms and said softly, "This is my child. He's almost half a year old. His name is Shinjing and do you think my name is good?" Yili nodded and said, "Will the child follow your surname?" Yili seemed to remember that Yaoji once mentioned that her original surname was Shen, and her name was Shinyao. Yaoji seemed to think of something and nodded silently. Looking at the originally peerless beauty in front of her now in such a sorry state, Yili's heart was filled with regret. "I remember that you had a lot of money when you left the capital. How did you end up in such a state?" Qing Cheng Lane was secretly sold to Yili. The money obtained was definitely enough for Yaoji and the child to live a life of luxury. Yaoji smiled bitterly and gently stroked the sleeping child, saying, "Yaoji is conceited and doesn't lose to anyone. But after leaving Qing Cheng Lane, I realized that other than singing and dancing, I don't know anything else. Although I hate the identity of a courtesan, this identity has allowed me to live freely these years. Otherwise, I'm afraid that I would have been bought back to be a concubine. Originally, I thought that although Muyang and I couldn't have a happy ending, at least we could part on good terms. Who knew?" Originally, after Yaoji left the capital, because she was already 3 months pregnant, she could only find a remote place near the capital to stay and wait for the child to be born before she set off for the future to start anew. Unexpectedly, several villages near the town where she temporarily lived belonged to Marquis Muyang's family. Among them, a steward recognized Yaoji's identity and reported it to Marquis Muyang. At that time, Yaoji's belly was already 6 months pregnant. Muyang was following Yili to fight in the northwest and hadn't returned. Although Marquis Muyang looked down on Yaoji's identity, at that time, the war in the northwest was a crisis. Marquis Muyang was afraid that something might happen to her son, so she didn't want to abort Yaoji's child. She just asked her family to keep an eye on Yaoji. With Yaoji's intelligence, how could she not guess that no matter whether Muyang could come back or not, the day the child was born would be the day she died. So she had to bribe the guards with her money and wait for an opportunity to escape, but she was caught and brought back. Marquis Muyang's family took all of Yaoji's money and didn't leave her even half a copper coin. When they came back, Yaoji was about to give birth. Fortunately, the woman in charge of taking care of Yaoji was soft-hearted and secretly reported to Muyang. When Muyang arrived, it was the day Yaoji gave birth. If Muyang didn't come quickly and break into the delivery room, Yaoji would have died of a hemorrhage that day. After that, because of Muyang's insistence, Yaoji and the child were settled in a courtyard in Marquis Muyang's mansion. Then Muyang married Miss Sunday. Yaoji rested for a few days. When Muyang came to see her and the child, she asked Marquis Muyang's mansion to return her money and then she would leave with the child. But Muyang didn't agree no matter what, and Marquis Muyang's family didn't admit that they took Yaoji's money at all. Yaoji was so angry that she almost fainted. She had saved up for so many years and Yili didn't treat her badly when she sold Qingqing Lane. Not counting the jewelry and treasures, only the banknotes were worth more than 200,000 taels. In order to prevent Yaoji from taking the money and trying to escape, Muyang acquiesced to his maternal family's statement. In this way, Yaoji couldn't even take out half a copper coin, let alone bribing the guards of the courtyard to escape. But Yaoji was stubborn. Every time Muyang went to see her, they always quarreled endlessly. And the behavior of Muyang's frequent visit to the courtyard naturally aroused the suspicion of the new Marquis Muyang. So when Muyang was ordered to go on official business by Marquis Muyang, who was already very dissatisfied with this, Yaoji and the child were almost starved to death in the courtyard. When Muyang came back, he naturally made a big fuss again. Then he took Yaoji and the child to a small courtyard under his name. Yaoji spent more than a month to soften her body and lower Muyang's guard. Then she took advantage of Muyang's drunkenness to escape with the child and a few worthless things and went all the way west. As for the people who chased after her and wanted to steal the child, she didn't know whether they were sent by Muyang or Marquis Muyang's mansion. Looking at Yi Li, who was still radiant with a big belly in front of her, Yaoji smiled bitterly. If Princess Ding encountered such a thing, she certainly wouldn't be as embarrassed as she was. During the days when she was locked in the courtyard and almost starved to death, Yaoji finally understood that it was simply a daydream to control her own destiny by herself. The reason why she was in the limelight for so many years was just that she had the title of the #1 dancer and Muyang and Feng San secretly protected her. Without these, she was just a useless woman who couldn't move an inch in this world. After listening to Yaoji's story, Yi Li didn't know whether to sigh or be angry. After pondering for a moment, Yi Li asked, "What do you plan to do in the future? According to what you said, your money was taken away by Marquis Muyang's mansion. I can ask someone to get it back for you. What do you plan to do in the future?" Yaoji looked down at the child in her arms and raised her head. "Yaoji begs your highness to find a good family to adopt my child. I don't ask for glory and wealth, as long as my parents live in harmony." Chapter 434. Yi Li frowned and asked in confusion, "What are you doing? If you don't want this child, why did you bring him out? If he stays in Marquis Muyang's mansion, Muyang won't mistreat the child because of your relationship." Yaoji smiled bitterly and looked at Yi Li. "I've heard about Princess's family. Princess, as the legitimate daughter of a noble family, is mistreated by her stepmother. Not to mention my son. Miss Sun wants to kill my son. How much can Muyang care about him? Besides, having a mother who used to be a dancer is not a matter of honor. Yaoji just wants him to be safe and sound for the rest of his life." Yi Li was a little embarrassed. She lowered her head and thought, "It's not convenient for me to do things now. Why don't you live in Ruyang City now and think about your future plans? If you insist, I'll find a good family for the child." Yaoji was overjoyed and said with tears in her eyes, "Shenyao thanks Princess." Although she said it resolutely, she was very reluctant to leave the child she carried for 10 months. Yi Li gave her more time to think. Although she had made up her mind, it was always good to be with the child for a while. She ordered Qin Feng to take Yaoji out. When Yi Li was thinking about Yaoji with her head down, Mo Xiaoyao strolled in. Seeing Yi Li frowning, Mo Xiaoyao quickly sat beside her and checked, "Why are you unhappy? Are you not feeling well?" Yi Li shook her head. She leaned in Mo Xiaoyao's arms and told him about Yaoji's matter. In the end, she sighed and said, "Muyang has really gone too far this time. Not only to Yaoji, but also to the newly married granddaughter. Even if the people who chased Yaoji were sent by Miss Sun, Yi Li wouldn't be too surprised." Hearing Yi Li worry so much about other people's business, Mo Xiaoyao was displeased. Letting her lean against his chest, he gently stroked her round belly and said, "Let other people take care of these trivial matters. If Li Li has the time to worry about these trivial matters, it's better to think about other things." Yi Li looked up at him with a smile and said, "What are you thinking about? Have you thought of a name for the baby?" Mo Xiaoyao frowned. "Is it so troublesome to come up with a name?" Yi Li's lips twitched. She looked at the jealous man and smiled, "Baby Mo? Are you sure the baby won't blame us for naming him like that?" As long as she thought of a handsome young man or middle-aged man who looked like Mo Xiaoyao staring at baby Mo, she couldn't help but laugh. Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyebrows and said, "Does he dare?" Yi Li nodded seriously and said, "Believe me, he really dares. As long as it was a man with such a name, he wouldn't be able to resist offending his superiors." Mo Xiaoyao snorted and said, "Then let's call him Mo Xiaobao." Yi Li rolled her eyes. She decided not to talk about this issue with him for the time being. If this man got angry and insisted on calling the baby Mo Bao Bao or Mo Xiaobao, she wouldn't be able to compete with him. In any case, there was still time to name the baby before he turned 1 year old. Otherwise, she could ask grandfather and uncle to name him. She calmly changed the topic and asked, "How is the matter of the previous dynasty's treasure? Why did it come back so soon?" Mo Xiaoyao casually said, "Wasn't it all Tan Jiji's doing? Did he think he could escape after causing trouble for I?" Yi Li asked curiously, "What did you do?" Mo Xiaoyao lightly said, "Of course I told his true identity to our emperor. It was also a show of loyalty to the Dechu state." Yi Li raised her eyebrows and said, "When Tan Jiji left the northwest, he should have been prepared for his identity to be exposed, right?" Mo Xiaoyao coldly smiled and said, "What if he added the imperial jade seal? Would anyone believe that the imperial jade seal is on him?" Yi Li asked. "There will be people who will believe it. When we return, send the shadow guard to kill Tan Jiji. There's no need to kill him. Just make him hand over the imperial jade seal." Mo Xiaoyao indifferently said. Yi Li understood and smiled. Even the Ding Palace was chasing after Tan Jiji for the imperial jade seal. Then those who were interested in the imperial jade seal would naturally have to think twice. As for who to believe, that was a matter of opinion. Mo Xiaoyao hugged Yi Li and lazily rubbed against her shoulder, saying, "Yi Li doesn't need to care about these trivial matters now. As long as baby Li is safely born, everything will be fine. Quickly get rid of this annoying brat. Then Yi Li would be his alone. Don't call him baby Mo. It doesn't sound nice." Yi Li seriously argued for her son's rights. Mo Xiaoyao indifferently changed his words, "Mo Xiaobao." Yi Li facepalmed and looked at the man's stubborn handsome face. She sighed, "Pet name." Mo Xiaoyao lightly snorted and didn't say anything. When the pet name was more famous than the official name, was there any difference between the official name and pet name? As a result, the handsome and famous future young master of the Prince Ding mansion had a pet name that he would never be able to get rid of in his entire life. When Qin Feng returned to the Chu capital this time, he didn't only bring back Yi Li's servants and chief steward Mo. He also brought back the Imperial Guard's deputy commander's beloved concubine and son. Xue Qingliang, who had been stubbornly refusing to say anything, couldn't hold back anymore when he saw the delicate and beautiful beloved concubine and the smart and adorable son who was 2 years old. He didn't even need to be punished. He directly confessed. In the dungeon, Mo Xiaoyao was still calmly and leisurely sitting on the large soft couch, coldly watching the family reunion in front of him. Feng Xiao and Qin Feng stood behind him and watched. After comforting his crying wife and son, Xue Qingliang stood up and said, "Prince, I can tell you whatever you want to know. But please, Prince, do not harm my wife and son no matter what." Mo Xiaoyao furrowed his brows and nodded, saying, "All right. I promise that as long as you tell me what I want to know, I will definitely not harm this mother and son. My body can give them a safe place to live." Xue Qingliang chuckled and said, "This one naturally trusts Prince Ding's personal promise. Prince, you can ask." Mo Xiaoyao waved his hand and had people take the mother and son away. The dungeon was quiet for a while before he asked, "Why did Mo Jingqi spend so much effort to save Su Zuidi?" Hearing this, not only was Xue Qingliang stunned, even Feng Xiao and Qin Feng couldn't help but be startled. Feng Xiao looked at Mo Xiaoyao and silently said in his heart, "Prince, don't tell me you still have feelings for that woman, Su Zuidi." It was probably because Feng Xiao's expression was too explicit that Mo Xiaoyao coldly glanced at him. Feng Xiao instantly felt a chill run down his spine. He lightly coughed and adjusted his expression, looking at Xue Qingliang with a serious expression. Xue Qingliang was very surprised by this question. His expression changed as he looked at Mo Xiaoyao's cold and calm expression. After a moment of silence, he said, "The Emperor and Su Zuidi have known each other since they were young. When the Emperor just ascended the throne, he mentioned to Su Darren that he wanted to take Su Xiaojie into the palace as a concubine, but was rejected by Su Darren." Mo Xiaoyao raised his eyes and said indifferently, "You want to tell I that the Emperor still has feelings for Su Zuidi and that's why he sent so many people to save her?" Xue Qingliang was silent. He also understood how absurd this answer was. He had followed Mo Jingqi before he ascended the throne, so he naturally knew what kind of person he was. Even if Su Zuidi was 100 times more beautiful, Mo Jingqi wouldn't pay such a great price just for a beautiful woman. Thinking, Xue Qingliang asked, "What does Prince want to know?" Chapter 435. Mo Xiaoyao looked down at his slender fingers and said, "For example, the relationship between Su Zuidi and Tan Jiji." Xue Qingliang frowned. Tan Jiji suddenly appeared by the emperor's side 10 years ago. The emperor values his intelligence and sees him as a think tank. As for his relationship with Miss Su, I don't know, but they know each other. Tan Jiji's real identity is the orphan of the previous dynasty's imperial family. Or, you can tell why Mo Jingqi trusts him so much. This, Commander Xue doesn't know, right? Hearing this, Xue Qingliang's face changed. He stared at Mo Xiaoyao in shock without realizing it. Mo Xiaoyao gave a cold snort, his sword-like eyebrows slightly raised as he said coldly, "Feng San, bring that child in for this prince." Xue Qingliang was startled as he hurriedly said, "No. Prince, please let that child go. I'll tell you everything you want to know." Mo Xiaoyao nodded with satisfaction. "Very good, Su Zuidi is in Ai's hands. But in these 2 months, countless people have come. Tan Jiji wants to kill, the emperor wants to save. I don't know when a woman became so important. Maybe you can give I an answer." Xue Qingliang's face was as white as paper. He looked at the tightly shut prison door. His wife and son were outside. If he said anything wrong, they would be consigned to eternal damnation. Weakly closing his eyes, Xue Qingliang finally opened his mouth and said, "I don't know much. I only remember that I took something from Miss Su under the emperor's orders and handed it to Tan Jiji." Mo Xiaoyao narrowed his eyes. "What is it?" Xue Qingliang said, "I don't know. It's just, the thing was taken from the Prince Ding mansion." After that, Tan Jiji went to the northern tribes alone. A month later, the previous Prince Ding and the Mahist army were defeated at the border of the northern tribes. So I guess, there is a connection. After saying this, Xue Qingliang fell to the ground as if he had lost all his strength. Although he wasn't a good person, he wasn't really a heartless and inhumane person. After the incident at the Prince Ding mansion, he had a vague feeling that these things would come back one day, but he did not expect that he would have to wait for 10 years. The prison cell was completely silent. Only the crackling of the burning firewood could be heard from time to time. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyes as he sat on the soft couch. A few strands of silver hair hung by his ears, making it impossible for others to see his expression. However, Feng Xiao and Qin Feng, who were standing behind him, could clearly see a few strands of silver threads moving even though there was no wind. The powerful and oppressive pressure made the two of them unconsciously take a few steps back. Both of them turned their heads at the same time and saw a look of disbelief on each other's faces. After a long time, when the 3 people in the cell were almost out of breath, Mo Xiaoyao said coldly, "Continue." Xue Qingliang's face was deathly pale. A trace of blood leaked out from the corner of his mouth. He did not think that Prince Ding's cultivation had already reached such a level. Just by using his inner strength, he was able to make him cough up blood. He shook his head and said, "At the time, I was only the emperor's personal guard, so I didn't know much. The reason why the emperor wanted to save Miss Su was because Miss Su seemed to have taken 2 things from the Prince Ding mansion. However, she only gave one to the emperor. The other is still in Miss Su's hands. As for the other things, I don't know." "Prince," Feng Xiao carefully called out. The silent Mo Xiaoyao was far more terrifying than when he was angry. Even though he knew logically that Mo Xiaoyao would not do anything to them, but Feng Xiao sighed. He quietly clenched his slightly trembling fingers in his sleeves. "Qin Feng, take Su Zuidi. I don't care what method you use. I don't care how you do it. Make her spit out the answer today." Qin Feng's heart trembled. He nodded and said, "This subordinate obeys." Feng Xiao frowned with some worry. "Prince, Su Zuidi's mouth is not ordinarily hard. What if, then let her die. Mo Xiaoyao said angrily, if you can't get the answer, send out all the Qilin. Capture all of Mo Jingqi's trusted aides. I don't believe that no one else knows about this. This subordinate obeys. Qin Feng nodded. He turned around and ran out of the prison without looking back. Prince. Feng Zhiyao only felt a bitter taste in his throat. He did not know what to say. The news that Xue Qingliang spat out was really too shocking. Just as he was in a difficult situation, there was a series of footsteps outside the door. Then he heard Director Mo's joyful voice, Prince. Reporting to Prince, Wang Fei is about to give birth. Mo Xiaoyao was stunned. He suddenly stood up. Feng Zhiyao only saw a white shadow flash in front of him. Mo Xiaoyao's figure was already gone from the prison cell. Bang! The soft bed that was originally fine instantly exploded into pieces, turning into a pile of debris. Looking at the pile of debris in front of him and Xue Qingliang, who was covered in wounds from the splashing wood shavings, Feng Zhiyao said indifferently, Commander Xue can be at ease here. Wang Fei is about to give birth to a son. If Prince is in a good mood, he may have a chance to live. Xue Qingliang smiled bitterly. He looked at Feng Zhiyao and said, Thank you for your comfort, young Master Feng San. That year, I had been panting for several years. I always felt that this day would come. I have no way to live. My wife and children are innocent. I only ask that Prince can let them live. Feng Zhiyao was silent. What Xue Qingliang had said was too shocking. If the prince didn't personally deal with it, no one would know what the final result would be. Glancing at Xue Qingliang, Feng Zhiyao turned and stepped out of the prison cell. The courtyard of the main courtyard was filled with people. The door to Yi Li's room was tightly shut, and there were only maids carrying water in and out of the room. However, before the crowd could take a look, the door was shut again. The people guarding outside the door saw a white shadow quickly fly over. In the blink of an eye, he was at the door. Mo Xiaoyao raised a hand to push open the door and enter. On the side, Su Qingze and Su Qingfeng each grabbed his hand. Mo Xiaoyao turned his head in displeasure. Even though Su Qingfeng had been trained under Qin Feng these 2 months, he couldn't help but release his hand. He smiled and said, Li Er is giving birth. Prince cannot enter. Mo Xiaoyao frowned and said, I will go in to see Li. Shenyang said in a cold voice, What is there to see about a woman giving birth? You cannot enter the delivery room. Prince doesn't know. An icy gaze shot like an arrow to Shenyang. Shenyang persisted for a moment before giving in. As a medical practitioner, he could clearly detect that the presence on Prince's body was not right. He paused before saying, It is not auspicious for a man to enter the delivery room. Mo Xiaoyao said coldly, I am not afraid. Shenyang was silent for a moment before finally saying, Wang Fei will give birth in about 2 to 4 hours. Prince can go in to see. Mo Xiaoyao gave a light snort before turning to push open the door and walk in. Outside the door, Su Qingyan said in dissatisfaction, Mr. Shen, why can Prince go in but you won't let us? Shenyang silently wiped his sweat and said, Because if I refuse, Prince will immediately kill me. Compared to rules, his life was more important. When Mo Xiaoyao entered, Mother Lin, who was guarding the door, stilled. She hurriedly said, Why did Prince come in? Without waiting for her to finish, Mo Xiaoyao said, I will go see Li and will leave in a moment. Chapter 436. Finishing, he passed by Lin Mama and went into the inner room. When the other people saw Mo Xiaoyao, they all stilled. Yi Li was lying on the bed. She had just started the labor pains and didn't seem like she was about to give birth. Seeing Mo Xiaoyao come in, she smiled faintly and asked, Why did you come in? Under the surprised gaze of the midwife, Mo Xiaoyao walked to the bed and sat down. His expression was slightly uneasy and dark. Yi Li smiled slightly and reached out to hold his hand, saying, Don't worry, nothing will happen to me. He lowered his head to see her slightly furrowed brows. He reached out to wipe the sweat from her forehead and asked in a gentle voice, "Does it hurt?" Yi smiled slightly and said, "It's fine. You can leave." Mo Xiaoyao shook his head, "I'll stay with you for a while." "Li, you have to be well." Yi smiled helplessly, "It's just giving birth, which woman doesn't give birth? It's fine." Wei Mama came in with a bowl of chicken soup that she wanted to make. She also stilled when she saw the person sitting by the bed. Mo Xiaoyao tilted his head and asked, "What is this?" Wei Mama said, "This is chicken soup that has been simmered for several shirchen." Wei Mama wanted to object, but when she saw Mo Xiaoyao's serious expression, she still handed the chicken soup over. Seeing Mo Xiaoyao carefully feed her miss the chicken soup with a spoon, she silently wiped the corners of her eyes and left. No matter what, the prince treated Wang Fei much better than Master treated Furin in the past. Mrs. eyes were much better than Furin's. Yi drank the chicken soup and allowed Mo Xiaoyao to talk with her for a while before pushing Mo Xiaoyao out. Mo Xiaoyao didn't want to, but Yi pinched him hard and said, "If you're here, I'll be distracted and it'll be more dangerous." Mo Xiaoyao finally stood and swept his gaze over the midwives and mamas in the room, saying, "Take good care of Wang Fei. If anything happens to Wang Fei, be careful of your little lives." Seeing Mo Xiaoyao walk out, Yi sighed helplessly and said to the frightened people in the room, "Prince is very worried. Don't be too nervous." Mother Lin carefully wiped Yi's sweat and said, "His Highness is concerned about the princess consort. We can't be happier for the princess consort." Yi smiled faintly and reached out to stroke her aching abdomen. Just now, Xiao Yao's mood was really not too good. He was probably really scared. She had heard that some fathers had fainted outside the delivery room. She hoped that Prince Ding would not be so useless. After another 2 hours, the delivery room became busy again. The people waiting outside anxiously listened to the voices of the midwives and Yi's moans. Compared to the screams of other women during labor, Yi's screams were not frightening. But it wasn't just Mo Xiaoyao waiting outside. Even Su Qingfeng and Su Qingza's faces were white. The usually mischievous Su Qingyan had nothing to say. He squatted beside Shenyang and Dr. Lin and couldn't help but ask every once in a while, "Was Li Jijie alright? How long would it take for her to reach out?" Shenyang was so annoyed that he kicked him aside and said angrily, "Some people can't give birth even after 14 to 16 hours. It's only been 4 hours, what are you so anxious for?" Instantly, Su Qingyan's face also turned white. He squatted by the door and didn't move. He was afraid that Li Jijie would also need 14 to 16 hours to give birth. How painful would that be? Su Qingfeng tried his best to ignore the moans coming from inside. His smile was a bit stiff as he said to Mo Xiaoyao, whose body was stiff, "I've seen eldest aunt give birth to fourth brother and fifth brother. There won't be any danger." Mo Xiaoyao stared at the tightly shut door. It was unknown if he heard anything. Yi remembered that in her previous life, there had been a discussion about whether it was more painful for a woman to give birth or for a man to be shot. Right now, Yi felt that she knew the answer. If being shot could make the child come out faster, she would rather be shot. "Woo!" The midwife at the side looked at her and said, "Wang Fei, don't hold it in, call it out." Yi was silent. What was she going to call out for? She used all her strength to shout and scream, how could she have the strength to give birth? And even if she called out, it would still be painful. Yi could only curse in her heart that her pain tolerance was worse than in her previous life. "Almost there. Almost there, quick, change the water." The midwife called out as she guided Yi on how to use her strength. It was August, and the room was still unbearably hot. With so many people around, it felt like a ball of hot air was rushing towards her body. After about half an hour, the people outside the door could not wait any longer. Only then did they hear Yi's painful moans from outside the door. Mo Xiaoyao's body trembled and he wanted to rush in. Suddenly, there was a cheer from inside, she gave birth. Then, there was the sound of a baby crying. At the side, Dr. Lin nodded and said, "From the sound of it, the child's health is not bad." Shenyang nodded and said, "It's a little worse than Prince's, but it will be fine after some rest." She gave birth. Su Qingfeng felt like he was in a dream. He turned around to look at Imo Xiaoyao beside him. Imo Xiaoyao was stunned for a moment. He lifted his leg and wanted to rush in. But he did not expect his body to sway and fall to the ground without any warning. Everyone panicked again. Shenyang said without any surprise, "Prince was too nervous. He used all the strength in his body to support his two legs. Now that he has relaxed, how can he not fall? He will be fine after some rest. The princess consort still needs to tidy up." Everyone looked at the calm Shenyang with an embarrassed expression. This was definitely revenge. Meeting Imo Xiaoyao's murderous gaze, Shenyang stood up and flicked the non-existent dust off his sleeves. Then, he slowly walked away. He still had to examine the little heir's body. The news that Princess Ding had safely given birth to a child quickly spread throughout Ruyang City. Not only were the people of the Prince Ding mansion rejoicing, the people of Ruyang City also decorated themselves with lanterns and colored banners as if it was the new year. Although the people had only seen this Princess Ding once or twice, in the hearts of the people of the Northwest, Princess Ding's position was not much lower than Prince Ding's. This was naturally because the Prince Ding mansion had done an excellent job of advertising. Although many people outside the Northwest misunderstood Prince Ding and Princess Ding because of Imo Jingqi's decree, the people of the Northwest all knew that the Prince Ding mansion had led the Mahist army to resist the West Hill invasion when she was pregnant. In the end, she had even fallen off a cliff. If it were not for Princess Ding, the Northwest would not have been able to maintain such peace and stability. In this chaotic world, whoever could provide the common people with a stable life would be their second parent. Therefore, when the people of the Northwest heard that Princess Ding had safely given birth, their joy was no less than the new year. In the Prince Ding mansion, the parlor closest to Yi Li's bedroom was already filled with people. When the midwife carried out the baby that had been washed clean and wrapped in red swaddling clothes, everyone immediately swarmed over. Su Qingyan was the happiest. He rushed to the front and shouted, "Quick, let me see what my little nephew looks like." The midwife smiled and said, "The little heir naturally looks very good. When he grows up, he will definitely be like the prince and princess, a giant among men." Su Qingyan happily took the midwife's hand. When he looked down, he was stunned. This red and wrinkled little thing in front of him was the giant among men that the midwife had mentioned. Although everyone present could be considered as the elites of the present age, there weren't many who had seen a newborn baby. Even Su Qingze and Su Qingfeng had not seen what Su Qingyan looked like when he was born. He was almost a month old. Naturally, he was white and tender when he was brought out. Everyone turned to look at Imo Xiaoyao, who was sitting at the side, in silence. Chapter 437. It was still Chief Steward Imo who said with joy, "The little Shitzi is exactly the same as Prince when he was born. The Prince Ding mansion finally has a descendant." His usually stern old face had a hint of a smile and affection. Standing in the middle, Ajin blinked and looked curiously at the little baby in the midwife's hands who had not opened his eyes. Su Qingyan asked in disbelief, "Chief Steward Imo, when the prince was born, he was also like this? Red and wrinkled like a little monkey?" Chief Steward Imo said matter-of-factly, "A child born naturally is like this. After a few days, he will open his eyes. When he opens his eyes, he will naturally be a white and tender little baby." Feng Zhiyao looked enviously at the red baby and sighed, "It has only been 2 years, but the prince already has a son. It really makes one envious." Chief Steward Imo said with a smile, "Feng Sangongzi is the same age as the prince. If he had married earlier, I'm afraid the little master would have run away." Feng Zhiyao's eyes dimmed slightly. He said with a smile, "How could it be so easy? It is not easy to meet a suitable person like the prince and Wang Fei." Everyone laughed as they finished looking at the baby. They made way for Lu Tong to carry the baby in front of Imo Xiaoyao. He said with a smile, Prince, look at the little Shitsi. Mo Xiaoyao glanced indifferently at the red and wrinkled little thing sleeping in the swaddling clothes. From his eyes to his expression, there was not a trace of disdain. He said faintly, ugly. Therefore, even though the little baby could not see, hear, or remember, the Prince Ding Mansion Shitsi, Xiao Bao, grew up to know that the first word his father said to him in this life was that he was ugly. The feud between father and son was settled at this moment. Glancing at his son, Mo Xiaoyao found that his legs were much better. He stood and asked, "Is Wang Fei well?" The midwife hurriedly said with a smile, "The birth of the little Shitsi was very smooth. Wang Fei did not suffer much. She is resting right now." In the midwife's view, Wang Fei's labor pains to the birth of her first child was only 4 hours. She really did not suffer much. But in Mo Xiaoyao's eyes, things were different. He only knew that Li Li was in pain for a few hours before giving birth to this ugly boy. He lightly snorted and said, "I will go and see Wang Fei." Then he flicked his sleeves and walked into the room. The midwife behind them couldn't help but sigh that the prince and Wang Fei were deeply in love. There weren't many men in the world who were busy visiting their wife instead of their newborn son. After confirming that his little nephew was not ugly, Su Qingyan happily continued to move forward. He carefully stretched out his finger and gently poked the baby's wrinkled little face. "Little nephew, I'm your uncle." Feng Zhiao rolled his eyes and said, "Can he understand now?" As he spoke, he was unwilling to be left out. He bent down and stared at the baby. "And? Did Prince really look like this when he was young?" Director Mo? Director Mo scrutinized for a moment and said, "Newborns all look like this, right?" "Out of the way, out of the way." Shenyang and Lin Fu walked side by side and looked at the crowd. This old man is going to examine the Shitsi's body. Unrelated people, move out of the way. The crowd was unwilling, but they could only watch as Shenyang skillfully took the child from the midwife's hands. Mo Xiaoyao walked back into the room. The Yahuan had already cleaned the room. Yi Li was sitting on the bed with her back against the soft cushion. Her face was slightly pale but her complexion was not bad. Lin Mama and Wei Mama were chatting with her. Wei Mama was sitting by the bed with a bowl of porridge in her hands and was about to feed Yi Li. Seeing Mo Xiaoyao come in, the two Mama hurriedly stood and bowed. Mo Xiaoyao waved his hand and asked, "How is Li Li?" Lin Mama smiled and said, "Wang Fei's body is good, nothing serious. It's rare to see a woman as energetic as Wang Fei after giving birth. Don't worry, Prince." Mo Xiaoyao took the porridge from Wei Mama's hands and said, "You can leave. I will stay with Li Li." The two Mama smiled and looked at Yi Li before turning to leave. Prince didn't stay outside to watch, but the little Shitsi was in a hurry to come in to see Wang Fei. This meant that he valued Wang Fei. They were naturally happy for Wang Fei. Seeing Mo Xiaoyao seriously holding the bowl of porridge to feed her, Yi Li said helplessly, "I can drink it myself." Actually, it wasn't painful or irritating to give birth. She had already given birth, so it wasn't a big deal to her. Why would she need someone to feed her? Mo Xiaoyao moved aside and avoided Yi Li's hand that she wanted to hold. He held the spoon and carefully held it to Yi Li's mouth. Yi Li had no choice but to open her mouth and eat. She asked, "Have you seen the baby?" Lin Mama and Wei Mama both said it looks as good as when I was young. Even though I can't tell. That little red and wrinkled ball, she really couldn't see how it looked like her. Maybe it was because she looked like this when she was young. Didn't all babies look about the same? Mo Xiaoyao thought of Chief Steward Mo's words. His mouth twitched as he nodded and said, "Look, it's very good." Yi Li smiled as she looked at him and raised an eyebrow suspiciously. Mo Xiaoyao said, "As long as it's given birth to Bai Li Li, it doesn't matter if it looks good or not." After Yi Li finished half the bowl of porridge, Lin Mama finally came back in with the baby. Yi Li had only taken one look at the baby before she was carried out. Seeing the baby now, she felt a strange feeling rise in her heart. This child was her and Mo Xiaoyao's child. It was her flesh and blood, and also the person closest to her in this world. Easily taking the baby from Lin Mama's arms, Yili tilted her head to look at his red little face and tightly shut eyes. She couldn't help but smile. She lovingly reached out to poke the baby's little face, then squeezed his little hand. Looking at this little thing, her heart was suddenly filled with tender love and joy. Mo Xiaoyao looked at the faint smile on Yili's face, then lowered his head to look at the sleeping baby in her arms. He only felt that this little fellow was incomparably dazzling. "Look, this is our baby. In the future, he'll call you father and call me mother. Do you like it?" Yili placed the baby in front of Mo Xiaoyao and asked with a smile. Mo Xiaoyao nodded and reached out to take the baby. "You just gave birth, you can't tire yourself out. Let me hold him." Yili looked at him suspiciously. "Do you know how to?" In these past few months, Mo Xiaoyao had never been very enthusiastic about this child. There was no need for him to learn how to hold a baby. Mo Xiaoyao hesitated. Although he didn't think it would matter how he held the baby, looking at the little thing in the swaddling clothes, he felt that it was so fragile that it would break if he wasn't careful. Although he didn't like this little fellow, who was very likely to compete with him for Yili in the future, he knew that Yili liked him very much. Seeing his hesitant appearance, Yili couldn't help but smile. She handed the baby to him and said with a smile, "Hold him like this, gently." After carefully guiding him, she placed the baby in Mo Xiaoyao's arms. Mo Xiaoyao lowered his head to look at the little thing in his arms and felt uncomfortable all over. Seeing Mo Xiaoyao sitting stiffly by the bed without any of his usual leisurely attitude, Yili secretly covered her mouth and smiled. In the eyes of the people in the northwest, the birth of Prince Ding's heir was probably similar to the birth of the crown prince of Dechu state. The sound of gongs, drums, and firecrackers filled the air in Ruyang City. It was as if it was the new year. Moreover, as soon as the news of the little heir's birth spread, the governor of Ruyang announced that all taxes in Ruyang City would be cut in half this year. There were also all sorts of announcements about the generosity of the people posted on the bulletin board outside the governor's office in Ruyang City. The commoners were naturally overjoyed. The sound of firecrackers could be faintly heard even in the prison cells. Chapter 438. In the cold and dirty dungeon, Su Zuidi, who was lying on the ground, moved her body with some difficulty. The sound of firecrackers coming from outside made the entire dungeon seem even colder and gloomier. It also made her mind, which was already not very clear, even more confused. Was it the new year again? She had almost forgotten how long she had been locked up here. The only thing she could remember was that she had to survive. As long as she was alive, she would have a chance to leave this place. As long as she was alive, she could get everything she wanted. Sometimes, she couldn't help but think that if she hadn't wanted so much in the past, would she have been able to peacefully be the second young madam of the Prince Ding mansion? With Mo Xiaoyao's military exploits, she might have been able to become the wife of a great general or something. But, she didn't just want those things. She, Su Zuidi, was extremely beautiful and talented. She was known as the #1 beauty in Dechu state. Why did she have to submit to those mediocre women? Survive, leave this place, and get everything she wanted. Su Zuidi told herself this every day. Clang! The door to the dungeon was opened and Qin Feng walked in with a cold expression. Zhua Jing and Lin Han were with him. The three of them didn't have good expressions. The little heir was about to be born and they couldn't go see the princess consort's newborn child first. Instead, they had to interrogate this woman. It really didn't make them happy. Hearing the footsteps, Su Zuidi climbed up and sat on the ground. She turned her head to look at the three and smiled. Is it starting again? Her face, which was mostly covered by dirt, flashed with a mocking smile and a proud expression. So what if these people tortured her every day? They still couldn't do anything to her. Every time she saw their frustrated and angry expressions, a strange pleasure would rise in her heart. Qin Feng casually kicked away the debris in front of him. He looked at her coldly and sneered, "Do you really think that's all we have to deal with you? Let me tell you some good news. The princess consort just gave birth to the little heir. Right now, Ruyang City is very lively. A trace of jealousy flashed through Su Zuidi's eyes, but she remained silent. Qin Feng didn't mind and said lightly, "There's another piece of bad news. The prince has given the order that we must know the answer by today." Su Zuidi sneered, "I don't know what you're talking about." Qin Feng nodded without any surprise, "I knew you would say that, so the prince also gave the order. If you can't get an answer, then you can go to hell." "What did you say?" Su Zuidi was stunned as she stared at Qin Feng in disbelief. Qin Feng looked at the woman on the ground mockingly and sneered indifferently, "I forgot to tell you. 2 months ago, we caught the deputy commander of the Imperial Guards, Xue Qingliang. You should know him, right? Nothing in this world is airtight. If I can't get the answer from you, why can't I get the answer from others?" Xue Qingliang. Su Zuidi was a little confused. Obviously, she didn't have any recollection of this name. Qin Feng lowered his head and thought for a moment before he understood. 10 years ago, Xue Qingliang was just one of Mo Jingqi's personal bodyguards. Su Zuidi might not remember him. He said, 10 years ago, you took something from the Prince Ding mansion to the current emperor. At that time, you gave it to this Commander Xue. Don't tell me you don't remember." Su Zuidi's eyes suddenly widened. She dragged her injured leg and quickly shrank into the corner. She screamed, "I don't know what you're talking about." "What thing?" "I didn't take anything from the Prince Ding mansion." Qin Feng looked sideways at Zhuo Jing and Lin Han beside him. The three of them naturally saw Su Zuidi's secretly trembling appearance. Zhuo Jing pursed his lips and said, "Drag her out and punish her. There's no need to have tender feelings for the fairer sex. After today, she'll be a dead person." 2 bodyguards obeyed and came in. They unceremoniously pulled Su Zuidi up from the ground and dragged her to the outer room of the dungeon. The outer room was much cleaner and drier than the inner room. There was also a row of tables and chairs. There was also someone sitting next to it grinding ink. Obviously, they were going to record a confession. Qin Feng and the other 2 sat down and opened the file on the table. Su Zuidi had already been helped to a wooden stake in front of them. Qin Feng looked coldly at the filthy woman in front of him. She didn't look like the #1 beauty in the world at all. "How about it? Miss Su, why don't you tell me yourself, or should we torture you slowly and see how many kinds of punishments you can endure?" Su Zuidi gritted her teeth and didn't say anything. Qin Feng leaned lazily against the back of the chair and said with a smile, "I'm not in a hurry today. Anyway, if I can't get the answer out of you before midnight, I can still report to the prince after killing you. As for whether you'll be missing an arm or a leg, I believe Miss Su herself won't mind." After looking at Su Zuidi with his head tilted for a long time, Qin Feng pointed to the 2 people standing next to him and said, "It's said that Miss Su is the #1 beauty in the world. If we cut her face a few times, will anyone still think she's beautiful?" Zhuo Jing curled his lips and said impatiently, "How does she look like the #1 beauty in the world? Even if she doesn't cut, she's still ugly." Qin Feng said with a smile, "How can that be? We haven't treated Miss Su poorly in the past 6 months. We definitely won't let her become sallow and emaciated. I bet her face is still very good." Lin Han frowned and said, "Then let's do it. Finish it quickly so we can go back." Qin Feng raised his chin. The bodyguard standing on the side took out a dagger and walked towards Su Zuidi. Looking at the cold gleaming dagger, Su Zuidi's eyes were filled with fear. She was conceited as the #1 beauty in the world. If her face was ruined. "No! You dare! The prince won't let you go. You dare to do this to me!" Qin Feng sneered disdainfully and said, "Stupid woman. The person who did it obviously didn't have the slightest bit of tenderness for the fairer sex." The dagger in his hand drew 2 silver flowers. Su Zuidi only felt a chill on her face and couldn't help but scream, "No! Ah, my face!" 2 perfect crosses appeared on both sides of her face. Blood rushed out of the wounds and flowed out. Su Zuidi only felt a chill in her heart. Only then did she realize that Qin Feng wasn't threatening her. Her face was really ruined. Ah! My face! My face, I'm going to kill you. Mo Xiaoyao, Yi Li, you deserve to die. The man standing in front of her slapped her twice without hesitation. Her face that was just injured was slapped twice again. Immediately, it swelled up red and dripped with blood. It looked very ferocious and terrifying. Su Zuidi's disfigured face was obviously more irritating to her than being crippled and tortured every day. After that, they continued to torture her. Su Zuidi still cursed endlessly, as if the harsh punishment didn't exist to her at all. Even Zhuo Jing couldn't help but sigh. If such a woman was properly trained as a spy, how outstanding would she be? At least he wouldn't have to worry about her betrayal due to torture. In the end, Qin Feng really ran out of patience. Although he still had some punishments that he hadn't used on Su Zuidi, it was really too bloody. The little prince had just been born and he didn't want to go too far. After midnight, Qin Feng's patience was completely exhausted. He stood up and ordered, "Do it. Let her watch herself die slowly. What a waste of my time. Pass down the order." According to Xue Qingliang's confession, immediately set out to the Chu capital to secretly capture all of Mo Jingqi's trusted aides and Tan Jiji from 10 years ago. Chapter 439. Yes, Commander. Su Zuidi's hands were tied to the wooden stake, and one of her wrists had a deep cut. Bright red blood dripped onto the ground, but the prison cell was quiet, and there was no one else. She turned her head to look at the blood dripping out, and she could only hear the sound of blood dripping. Gradually, Su Zuidi only felt something buzzing in her ears, and Qin Feng's cold voice suddenly rang in her ears. The princess consort just gave birth, and Ruyang City is bustling with noise and excitement. Bustling, why couldn't she hear anything? Seeing more and more blood on the ground, she clearly felt her body begin to weaken, as if she could feel the blood flowing out of her pulse. She even felt that she would slowly die until the last drop of blood flowed out of her. No. I don't want to die, help. I want to see Mo Xiaoyao. I'll tell you everything. There was no one outside the door, and Su Zuidi fearfully discovered that she really would die here. This fear made her panic even more, and she even felt her blood flow faster. I'll tell you everything. Help. I don't want to die. Outside the door, Qin Feng's lips curled into a cold smile. Wouldn't it have been better if you said so earlier? I thought she would be stubbornly refusing to say anything. Lin Han said, it's probably because she knows she has nowhere to go this time. Even if she doesn't say anything, Xue Qingliang will. Before, she was just relying on the fact that no one else knew. Go and report to the prince. Although it was already the second night watch period, there were still people in the Prince Ding mansion who were awake. Mo Xiaoyao sat by the bed, looking at the sleeping Yi Li, his expression gentle and calm. He raised his hand to gently caress the pale and beautiful face he had chosen, a trace of tenderness and warmth appearing in his eyes. Beside the bed, there was a small cradle covered in soft silk, and the baby was also sleeping soundly. Looking at the adult and child in front of him, Mo Xiaoyao didn't have the slightest hint of sleepiness in his eyes. He bent over to look at the baby in the cradle, and seeing that there was no one around, he couldn't help but reach out to pinch the baby's tender little face. Although he had been very careful to control his strength, the baby still pouted uncomfortably, as if he was about to cry. Mo Xiaoyao quickly retracted his hand and sat up straight to look down at the baby in the cradle. From the looks of it, he was going to be a father. She remembered her father's strictness and love in the Prince Ding mansion. Every time he got into trouble, his father would punish him mercilessly, and his brother would plead for him. However, he knew that every time after he was punished, his father would secretly come to see him in the middle of the night and sigh helplessly. He had never thought that he would be a father one day, and when he found out that Li Li was pregnant under such circumstances, one could imagine the anger in his heart. Therefore, He had always felt that he did not like this child. However, the soft and warm feeling that filled his heart was completely different from the feeling he had for Lily. This was his son. Right now, he needed his protection. When he grew up, he needed his guidance. Then, he would grow up to be a man as tall as him. Don't fight with me for Lily, otherwise father will properly dote on you. Bending over, Mo Xiaoyao stared at the sleeping baby in the cradle as he warned. Yili opened her eyes in a daze and saw Mo Xiaoyao sitting by the bed with his head lowered as he said something to the baby. She couldn't help but laugh softly. Being discovered by his beloved wife, Mo Xiaoyao's face froze. He pretended that nothing had happened and sat back down on the bed as he softly said, "Why are you awake?" Yili saw that he hadn't even changed his clothes. It was clear that he hadn't slept at all. "Why aren't you resting?" Mo Xiaoyao pulled her into his embrace and said in a muffled voice, "I can't sleep." Yili sat up from his embrace and pushed the distance between them apart. She carefully looked at his expression and softly asked, "What's wrong? It can't be that you're too excited about the birth of the baby, right?" Mo Xiaoyao curled his lips in disgust as he glanced at the baby lying in the cradle. Yili helplessly smiled. From the moment the baby was born, he had already been looked down upon by his own father. If she didn't understand Mo Xiaoyao's personality and thoughts, Yili would have suspected that he hated his own child. This father and son. How would they get along in the future? "I saw that your expression wasn't right before, but I didn't have time to ask you. Did something happen?" Leaning against Mo Xiaoyao, Yili softly asked. Mo Xiaoyao raised a hand to ruffle Yili's half-falling hair. A cold light flashed in his eyes as he lightly said, "The matter of Tan Jiji and Su Zuodi that we were investigating before is about to be concluded." "Oh?" Yili raised her head. Just by looking at Mo Xiaoyao's gloomy expression, she knew that this matter was very shocking. She lightly patted Mo Xiaoyao's hand and comforted him, "No matter what happens, we will always be together." Mo Xiaoyao was startled. He nodded and said, "I know. Prince, Commander Qin requests an audience." Outside, Qingyu, who was on night watch, reported in a low voice. Mo Xiaoyao nodded. He stood up and said to Yili, "I'll go take a look. Yili should rest first." Yili also knew that her body wasn't well right now. She nodded and thought for a moment before saying, "If Su Zuodi really wants to confess, there's no harm in having Elder Su listen." Mo Xiaoyao nodded. "I know. Don't worry about these things. Rest well." After helping Yili lie down and covering her with a blanket, Mo Xiaoyao turned and walked out. He glanced at Qingyu and Qingluan who were waiting at the door and said, "Take good care of the princess." Qingyu and Qingluan stood up and said, "Prince, please be at ease." In the empty room, Su Zuodi was sitting on a chair placed in the middle of the room. There wasn't even anyone in the room to watch over her. Right now, no one would be worried that she would escape or commit suicide. The large amount of blood she had just lost and the various tortures she had undergone in the past half-year, she didn't even have the strength to walk 100 steps out of this room. She had just been dragged away to be cleaned and changed into clean clothes. Su Zuodi looked at the clean clothes on her body, lost in thought. The dirty and gloomy prison life of the past half-year had almost made her forget what it was like to be clean. She could only constantly convince herself to forget in order to survive in that kind of environment. But now, she finally couldn't hold on any longer. When she felt her blood flowing out drop by drop, she finally realized how terrible death really was. If those people had come a little later, perhaps she would have already lost all her blood. From the moment she opened her mouth to beg for mercy, she had already lost. She definitely couldn't bear to let herself experience that slow and quiet death again. The door was opened from the outside and Mo Xiaoyao strolled in. Behind him were Qin Feng, Zhuojing and Feng Xiao. Mo Xiaoyao walked to the side and sat down. The others also took their seats one after another. Su Zuodi stared blankly at the white-haired man in front of her. The Mo Xiaoyao in front of her was dressed in white and had a head of white hair. His expression was calm and his eyes were indifferent, giving off a distant and cold feeling. This was completely different from the Mo Xiaoyao in Su Zuoti's memory. Xiaoyao. You're Xiaoyao. Why are you? Mo Xiaoyao frowned and impatiently glanced at Qin Feng. Qin Feng looked at Su Zuoti and said in a deep voice, Miss Su, since you're willing to confess, then say it in front of Prince. It's the middle of the night and everyone doesn't have much time to waste. Chapter 440. Su Zuoti immediately sobered up, meeting the cold light in Mo Xiaoyao's eyes, and said sorrowfully, Xiaoyao, are you really not going to give me any face? Do you still remember that we grew up together? I know I was wrong. Mo Xiaoyao stood up, coldly staring at Qin Feng and said, this is the result you were talking about? Wasting I's time. Deal with it. Send someone to Chu capital as soon as possible. After saying that, he actually turned around and walked out. The so-called deal with naturally referred to dealing with Su Zuoti. As long as he knew a little, he wouldn't be afraid that he wouldn't be able to find out what happened afterwards. Su Zuoti's usefulness would also be insignificant, compared to facing this woman that he loathed. He might as well go back to his room and accompany Lili. Su Zuoti was stunned, clearly not expecting Mo Xiaoyao to be so heartless. She had only said a few words and he had already left impatiently. Su Zuoti felt a chill in her heart, looking at Qin Feng who was staring at her with murderous intent. She screamed in horror, No! No! I'll talk. I'll tell you whatever you want to ask. Why didn't you say so earlier? Feng Zhiyao sneered, sitting back down in his chair. What did you take away from the Prince Ding mansion that year? Qin Feng asked. Su Zuoti glanced at Mo Xiaoyao who was sitting in his chair with his eyes closed, gritted her teeth and said, It's the Mahist army's marching formation map. I have an excellent memory since I was young. I only saw those maps once and remembered them in my heart. After leaving the Prince Ding mansion, I found them and drew them out. Everyone's expression changed, recalling the Mahist army's crushing defeat against the northern tribes 10 years ago. Qin Feng frowned and continued to ask, You gave the map to Tan Jiji and Mo Jingqi? Su Zuoti nodded and said, Yes, Mo Jingqi sent Tan Jiji to find me, asking me for help, so I agreed. What are they going to do with the map of the Mahist army? Feng Zhiyao asked. Although he already knew the answer, he still needed Su Zuoti to confirm it. Su Zuoti looked at Feng Zhiyao and suddenly giggled. What's the use? Mo Jingqi had long found the Mahist army and Mo Xiaoyan an eyesore. Hence, he naturally gave the blueprint to the northern tribes. Otherwise, why do you think the Mahist army was ambushed by the northern tribes and suffered such heavy casualties? Qin Feng's face was gloomy. His family had been working for the Prince Ding mansion for generations. His father and several of his uncles had died in that battle. Staring at the smiling Su Zuoti, Qin Feng asked, Why did you help Mo Jingqi frame the Prince Ding mansion? This was also something that everyone was puzzled about. As the fiancé of the second young master of the Ding mansion, Su Zuoti was envied by many noble ladies. Why did she help Mo Jingqi to destroy the Prince Ding mansion? This did not benefit her at all. Su Zuoti was stunned and looked at Mo Xiaoyao who seemed to be asleep. She sneered and raised her uninjured hand to point at Mo Xiaoyao. Why? Why, do you have to ask him? Feng Zhiyao raised his eyebrows and looked at Mo Xiaoyao. Could it be that Prince Ding mansion did something to let you down? Even so, this woman's revenge method was a little too cruel. No wonder she could last so long in Qin Feng's hands and not die. Su Zuoti chuckled and looked at Mo Xiaoyao with eyes full of resentment and inexplicable love and madness. Let me down. No, he didn't let me down. But, he also didn't let me down. I, Su Zuoti, am the #1 beauty and talent in the Chu state. There are many princes and princesses who admire me. But in his eyes, I'm just an engaged fiancé. Feng Zhiyao frowned. He and Mo Xiaoyao became close friends when they were young. He also saw how Mo Xiaoyao treated Su Zuoti. It really wasn't bad. The second young master of the Prince Ding mansion was famous in the capital. Many noble ladies threw themselves at him, but he never pretended to be nice. Only Su Zuidi, who was engaged, was very good to him and only close to her. So what was there for Su Zuidi to be dissatisfied with? Seeming to understand Feng Xiao's expression, Su Zuidi snorted and proudly said, "Even the Prince Ding mansion was very protective of me and obeyed me. But since I've already been engaged to him, he won't even agree to a small request." Her words made it seem like she was lowering herself to be engaged to Mo Xiaoyao. Looking at the man who was as cold as snow in front of her, Su Zuidi's eyes blurred and she said softly, "But it doesn't matter. I love him. Even if all the princes and princesses in the capital came to court me, I would only love Xiaoyao." "Why? Xiaoyao, why won't you even agree to a small request? The regent dotes on you so much. As long as you beg him, he will definitely pass the position of Prince Ding to you. And Mo Xiaowen. He has no interest in marching and fighting. You clearly have more military achievements than him. Why do you want to give the position of Prince Ding to him? How can I only be the second young mistress of a small Prince Ding mansion for the rest of my life? Then how can I let those women step on my head? I love you so much, but you won't even do such a small request for me." The room was completely silent. Qin Feng and the other two looked at the woman sitting in the chair as if they had seen a ghost. With a few scars and a red and swollen face, coupled with the infatuation, gentleness, and resentment, her twisted expression, it was clearly exceptionally sinister and terrifying. As if she had finally vented out all the grievances she had suffered for so many years, Su Zuidi seemed to be unable to control herself. She continued to blabber, "This is all your fault. If you had been Prince Ding back then, everything would have been fine. But I only carefully tested you and you actually gave me such a look and even reprimanded me. Mo Xiaoyao. This is all your fault. Haha, how can I let those ugly women step on my head and flaunt their prowess? Only I, Su Zuidi, should be a noble woman who is admired and envied by tens of thousands of people. You actually aren't willing to fight with Mo Xiaowen. I'll help you. As long as Mo Xiaowen dies, the position of Prince Ding will be yours and I will be Princess Ding. What's wrong with that? Why can't I help Mo Jingqi and Tan Jiji?" The more she spoke, the more excited Su Zuidi became. The expression on her face also became crazier. She pointed at Mo Xiaoyao and laughed maniacally, "But, why are you injured? Why are you disfigured? Why are you a cripple? Mo Xiaoyao, it's all your fault. Who asked you not to listen to me? Who asked you not to love me? If you loved me, you should have done everything I wanted to do for me, just like Han Mingyue." The first time I saw Han Mingyue, I knew he was a gullible fool. Sometimes, I also wish that you were as gullible as him. Why won't you listen to me? Isn't it enough that I love you so much? If you listened to me, how could Mo Xiaowen have died? It's all your fault. How could Mo Xiaowen not have died? It's you who should have died. A white figure flashed across the room. In the blink of an eye, Mo Xiaoyao was already in front of Su Zuidi. A hand mercilessly choked her slender neck. His gaze was cold as he stared at the woman who was struggling with a twisted expression. "Who killed my brother?" Mo Xiaoyao asked coldly. Su Zuidi was choked by the choke and immediately couldn't breathe. She raised her hand and tried to pry Mo Xiaoyao's hand away. But with her strength, how could she be Mo Xiaoyao's opponent? After a while, she started to roll her eyes. "Speak." Chapter 441. Mo Xiaoyao. Jing. Seeing that she was about to die, Su Zuidi suddenly let go. A large gust of air rushed in and Su Zuidi started coughing violently. "Who killed my big brother?" Mo Xiaoyao asked again. Mo Jingqi and the Lu family, as well as the northern tribes, southern Zhao and the emperor of Shiling's clan. Mo Xiaowen did not die of illness, he was assassinated, cough cough. Looking at Mo Xiaoyao in front of her, Su Zuodi did not dare to hide anything. And the regent was killed by the late emperor's scheme. But, the regent also sent people to severely injure the late emperor before he died, so the late emperor died within 2 years. This is, cough cough cough, this is what Imo Jingqi told me. Seeing that Imo Xiaoyao was silent, Su Zuodi quickly said, it's true. The late emperor had people poison the regent with drunken incense. It's a strange, colorless and tasteless poison. After being poisoned, there will be no abnormalities at first, but after 5 days, the person will show signs of a serious illness and die without treatment. No matter how skilled the doctor is, he will not be able to find the cause of death. Feng Zhiyao, Qin Feng and Zhua Jing looked at each other, their hearts trembling. Of course, they knew what drunken incense was. It was rumored that it was one of the 3 most mysterious poisons in the world, along with Heaven Underworld and Red Beauty Withered Bones, that had been lost for thousands of years. But the fact that the regent's death was related to the late emperor was even more shocking than Imo Jingqi being related to Imo Xiuwen's death. The regent Imo Lufang could be said to be a rare virtuous official. Before the late emperor ascended the throne, the Dechu state was not much better off than it was now. Xiling and the northern tribes were eyeing it covetously. At that time, Prince Ding, who was not yet 20 years old, single-handedly resisted the 2 armies of Xiling and the northern tribes. After that, he led the army to quell the rebellion. When the late emperor ascended the throne, Imo Lufang, who was in his early 20s, was conferred the title of regent. Martial arts could pacify the country and literature could govern the country. Different from many regents who usurped power and bullied the young emperor, Imo Lufang did his best to assist the previous emperor. After the previous emperor passed away, he took the initiative to resign from the position of regent. 20 years of harmony between the ruler and his subjects could be said to be a good story for all eternity. Now that Su Zuodi had revealed such a secret, how could it not be shocking? Was history really written to fool the world? Imo Xiaoyao strolled back to his seat and sat down, deep in thought. Of course. The other to Imo to ask, he said Shue said you took 2 things from the Prince Ding mansion that year. Of that year you took two items to you to ask to Imo to ask. To ask. Where is of that thing of that? The expression on Su Zuodi's face froze, and her already ugly face became even scarier. To ask of Emperor of. To say to of that to ask. To king to leave, to the king state emperor of his. Of. To his the to his. To ask. Of to his. What does it say? Su Zuodi said, the decree of Emperor Taizu is that the royal family of the Dechu state and the king state Ding will forever be brothers. If the future emperor goes against the grain and intends to harm the king state Ding, the prince of Ding can depose the emperor and appoint a new emperor. Everyone was shocked. It was such an important thing, no wonder Imo Jingqi had to save Su Zuodi. Where is it? Feng Zhiyao asked. With this thing, wasn't it Imo Jingqi that bastard they were afraid of? Su Zuodi gritted her teeth and said, do you think I will tell you? Su Zuodi was not a fool. After revealing these things, this was her only life-saving talisman. Imo Xiaoyao stood up and ordered in a calm voice, Qin Feng, get rid of her. After that, he turned and walked out. Su Zuodi stared at Imo Xiaoyao in disbelief and screamed, don't you want Emperor Taizu's imperial decree? Imo Xiaoyao turned back and smiled coldly, if I want to kill Imo Jingqi, I can do it even without Emperor Taizu's decree. After that, he didn't look at Su Zuodi who was paralyzed on the ground and walked out of the room. Outside the door, in another room, Su Zhe, Han Mingyue, Han Mingxi, Lu Jingxian and others were all there, but their expressions were very different. Su Zhe's face was red and white, his lips and hands were trembling non-stop. It was obvious that he was very angry. Han Mingyue's face was pale, and even when Imo Xiaoyao came out, she acted as if she didn't see it. Lu Jingxian, Uncle Imo and others were angry and wanted to rush in and kill Su Zuodi immediately. The calmest one was Han Mingxi, but he also couldn't hide his shock. Elder Su can go in and see her. Mo Xiaoyao said calmly. Su Zhe's throat made two gurgling sounds, and after a while, he could barely speak. He forced a smile and said, I can teach her. This evil creature actually committed such a sin. How can I face the ancestors of the Su family? With a "puf" sound, a mouthful of blood spurted out from Su Zhe's mouth, and his whole body collapsed. Han Mingxi, who was the closest and the most clear-headed, quickly stepped forward to support Su Zhe. Su Zhe said, this evil creature. Prince should deal with her. Seeing that Su Zhe had fainted, Mo Xiaoyao was silent for a moment, then said, please, Mr. Shen. Lu Jingxian wanted to say something, but Uncle Mo secretly pulled him aside and said, it's already late, it won't be too late to deal with the rest tomorrow. Besides, Princess Consort just gave birth to the little Shitzi, she will feel uneasy if she doesn't see the prince when she wakes up. Mo Xiaoyao nodded and said, you all should also go back early. Seeing that Mo Xiaoyao had left, Lu Jingxian said angrily, I still have something to say, Director Mo, how can you? Director Mo shook his head and said, let the prince rest first. Since the matter is already known, is there a need to be afraid of not being able to get revenge? This kind of matter, even they were shocked when they heard it, not to mention how much of an impact it would have on the prince's heart. Prince's body wasn't good to begin with, if he collapsed because of this, then the gains wouldn't make up for the losses. Understanding that what Director Mo said was reasonable, Lu Jingxian fiercely glared at the wall in front of him and said in a rough voice, fine, there's still plenty of time in the future. I'm also going back. The people in the room quickly left. Han Mingyue stared blankly at the tightly shut door in front of him, but he couldn't move at all. He knew that in the room, perhaps Su Zuidi was slowly dying, but he couldn't make himself stand up and push open the door that wasn't locked at all. The first time I saw Han Mingyue, I knew that he was a gullible idiot. The first time, in the peach blossom forest, the 14-year-old boy saw the 13-year-old girl in pink dancing to her words. Is young Master Xiaoyao's friend? Zuidi greets young Master Mingyu. From then on, she fell into a love barrier and couldn't break free. Early in the morning, hearing light footsteps outside, Yili opened her eyes. Looking sideways at the empty seat beside her, Mo Xiaoyao didn't come back last night. Qing Shuang came in with water. Seeing that Yili had woken up, she hurriedly put down the basin and carefully helped Yili sit up. Yili nodded and asked, Prince didn't come back last night? Qing Shuang nodded and said, I heard from Qing Yu and Qing Wanjiejie that the prince rested in the study last night. Do you want this servant to invite the prince over? Mama has instructed that Wang Fei is going through confinement now and can't get out of bed. Yili shook her head and looked at herself helplessly. In this era, confinement was really unbearable, but she didn't intend to make things difficult for her body. Looking sideways at the little baby who was still sleeping soundly in the cradle, she couldn't help but smile. Why is baby still sleeping? Wei Mama came in with a bowl of porridge. Hearing this, she couldn't help but smile. Wang Fei is young and hasn't taken care of a child before, so you don't know. This newborn child eats and sleeps every day. The little Shitzi will grow faster if he sleeps more. Chapter 442. Yili smiled as she took the hot towel that Qing Shuang handed her to wipe her face and hands. She then used warm water to rinse her mouth before taking the porridge from Wei Wei and tasting it. The light and pleasant taste made Yili sigh in relief. Have you arranged for the little Shitzi's wet nurses? Wei Mama smiled and said, we have prepared 4 wet nurses long ago. We know them well. Wang Fei, don't worry. Hearing this, Yili frowned slightly and said, 4 is too many. Leave 1 or 2 first. Other than feeding time, send the little Shitzi to me at other times. Wei Mama looked with some difficulty at Yili. Even though she was also Wang Fei's wet nurse, she approved of not letting the wet nurses get too close to the little Shitzi. Otherwise, when the little Shitzi grew up with the wet nurses, he would not be close to Wang Fei. But if Wang Fei personally took care of him, she was afraid that the prince would not be happy. Yili smiled faintly and said, let's do it this way. When the child is 1 year old, it will be about time to stop breastfeeding. At that time, we can arrange for the wet nurses to go elsewhere. She did not plan for the wet nurses to raise the child, nor did she plan for a group of wet nurses and servant girls to surround the child. She did not want to raise a Jia Baoyu in the future. Wei Mama reminded her in a small voice, if Wang Fei personally takes care of the little Shitzi, the prince will not be happy. Yi Li smiled and said, it's not a problem. Usually, the wet nurse and Lin Mama will help me. When he grows up, he won't need anyone to take care of him. Wei Mama finally agreed. She bent down to pick up the infant who was about to wake up and went to find the wet nurse to feed him. After finishing a bowl of porridge, Yi Li handed the bowl to Qing Xia, who was serving beside her, and asked, did anything happen last night? Qing Shuang replied, Elder Su, who was staying in Nanyuan last night, seemed to be ill. The prince asked Sir Shen and Dr. Lin to treat him. I heard that his illness is very serious. Qing Xia also nodded and said, Prince hasn't gone out since he returned to his study last night. I heard that the person who delivered breakfast this morning was also stopped outside. Yi Li frowned and pondered for a moment before saying, Qing Shuang, go to the kitchen again and send a portion of breakfast to Prince. Tell him that I ordered it. Also, ask Commander Qin to come over. Tell him I have something to ask him. Qing Shuang nodded and said, this servant will go now. Your subordinate, Qin Feng, requests an audience with your highness. Not long after, Qin Feng appeared outside the door and asked for an audience. Yi Li said softly, come in. Yi Li and Mo Xiaoyao had never paid much attention to such formalities. Now that Yi Li couldn't go out, Qin Feng stood in front of the screen with the painting of a misty rain in the room and replied. Qin Feng also understood what Yi Li wanted to ask. Without waiting for Yi Li to ask in detail, he told her what happened last night in detail. This naturally included the treatment of Su Zuidi. Su Zuidi struggled for more than half a year, but in the end, she still came to the end. But before she died, she still told him the whereabouts of the ancestors' decree. If Mo Xiaoyao didn't want that thing, then Su Zuidi would not be his life-saving talisman, but a piece of waste paper. That thing was still in the Chu capital. Back then, Su Zuidi left in a hurry with the help of Han Mingyue, so she didn't have time to look for the thing she hid. What's more, that thing was more like a talisman that hastened her death. Hearing Qin Feng's words, Yi Li was also startled. Although after the incident with Tan Jiji, Yi Li had some guesses about this matter, but it was far from being as shocking as hearing it for herself. What's more, it also involved the life and death of the late emperor and the regent Mo Lufang. It seemed that the imperial family had been trying to get rid of the Prince Ding mansion for a long time. Does the prince have any plans to deal with this matter? Yi Li asked. Qin Feng shook his head and said, the prince has been locked in the study since last night, and hasn't issued any orders. Yi Li nodded. This was undoubtedly the biggest impact on Mo Xiaoyao, and he really needed time to think about it. It wasn't until noon that Mo Xiaoyao came back with a tired body. Looking at his bloodshot eyes, Yi Li knew that he must have not slept all night. Sighing, she didn't allow him to say anything and said softly, sleep for a while first, we'll talk about it when you wake up. Mo Xiaoyao was extremely tired. Earlier, he was angry because of Xue Qingliang's confession, then he was tense because of Yi Li's labor, and last night, he was shaken because of what Su Zuidi had revealed. If it wasn't for the fact that Mo Xiaoyao had made great progress in his cultivation these past few years, he probably wouldn't have waited for Su Zuidi to finish speaking and would have killed her with his sword and led his troops to the capital. From yesterday morning until now, Mo Xiaoyao hadn't closed his eyes. Too many things had happened today, how could he not be tired? Lying on his side on the bed, Mo Xiaoyao glanced at Yi Li who was tucking him in. After opening and closing his eyes a few times, he finally fell into a deep sleep. Looking down at the man who was sleeping restlessly, Yi Li could only sigh softly. Leaning against the headboard, she closed her eyes and thought about the northwest. Now that the truth of what had happened that year was revealed, to be able to wake Mo Xiaoyao up, the situation in the northwest and Dechu state had changed. Yi Li didn't want to stop Mo Xiaoyao from doing anything. Just like the Mahist army, Mo Xiaoyao had been suppressed for too long. And the actions of the person in the Chu palace didn't make people believe that he was a good ruler who loved his people like his own children. Big brother. Father. Big brother. Big brother. Mo Xiaoyao murmured in his sleep, as if he had fallen into a terrifying dream. Yi Li remembered the meter of Su Zuidi that Qin Feng had mentioned and her heart trembled. Gently patting the blanket on his body, she whispered, "This isn't your fault, Xiaoyao, don't be afraid, it's not your fault, father, big brother." When Mo Xiaoyao woke up, he heard Yi Li's soft laughter by his ear. Opening his eyes, Yi Li was sitting next to him, leaning against the bed. She was holding the baby in light purple swaddling clothes and playing with him. There was a soft and gentle smile on her beautiful face. Yi Li turned her head and saw Mo Xiaoyao open his eyes. She couldn't help but smile and say, "Are you done? Look at the baby." Mo Xiaoyao sat up and looked at the baby in the swaddling clothes. He was looking at the two of them with watery eyes. The red and wrinkled face from yesterday was much better. Even though it wasn't completely white and tender, it was still very different from the red little monkey from yesterday. Yi Li lovingly cradled the baby and gently rocked him. This child was really too good at sleeping. Other than when he was born, this was the first time she had seen him awake. Hee, the baby can't see right now. In a few days, he will become more and more adorable. Mo Xiaoyao silently watched as Yi Li played with the baby. Even though he felt that the little boy was particularly annoying, he didn't say anything. He only quietly watched as Yi Li's smile became more gentle and kind. His originally cold and hard expression couldn't help but soften. When the baby fell asleep again, Yi Li called for Wei Momo to carry him out. Turning her head to look at Mo Xiaoyao's side, she saw that his face was still somewhat gloomy and said softly, "Those things weren't your fault. Big brother won't blame you." Mo Xiaoyao was stunned. When he regained his senses, he finally understood what Yi Li was talking about. He raised his hand to ruffle the hair behind Yi Li's head and said with a dry voice, "Mother passed away not long after giving birth to me. Father was also busy with court affairs. It could be said that it was Big Brother who raised me since I was young. Originally, I wanted to wait for Big Brother to inherit the throne and then assist him wholeheartedly. For many generations, the Ding King's residence had only one heir. It was only in our generation that Big Brother and I were born. We brothers naturally had to work together. Furthermore, with my ability, even if I can't obtain any title, I can't just idle around in the Prince Ding mansion and be a hedonistic son of rich parents." Yi Li naturally knew this. Actually, Mo Xiaowen and Mo Xiaoyao were only 7 to 8 years apart. Yi Li could almost imagine the scene when Mo Xiaowen, who was only 7 to 8 years old, carried his newborn brother and guarded the cold and empty Prince Ding mansion. It was no wonder that the relationship between the two brothers was so good. In Mo Xiaoyao's heart, the position of Big Brother was not inferior to that of Father King Mo Lufang. It was also because of this that Mo Xiaoyao, who was only in his teens, had already entered the battlefield. It was also to tell Father and Big Brother that even if he couldn't inherit the throne, he could still fulfill his ambitions and live a carefree life. Chapter 443. It's just that I underestimated that bitch Su Zuidi. If it wasn't for me. At that time, Su Zuidi had indeed mentioned the matter of the Prince Ding mansion's throne to him. At that time, he had fiercely reprimanded Su Zuidi and ordered her not to mention this matter again, and then put it to the back of his mind. At that time, he thought that with his relationship with his big brother, how could he be instigated by a woman, and even more so, he didn't think that Su Zuidi would have any tricks up her sleeve. But he didn't think that because of this, he would plant a seed of disaster for the Prince Ding mansion and his big brother. Even he himself had to pay a heavy price. Yi Li sighed softly and comforted him softly, "Big brother won't blame you, Xiaoyao, this isn't your fault." Since Mo Jingqi already had the intention to deal with the Prince Ding mansion and big brother, even if Su Zuidi didn't have that intention, she might have let them find other opportunities. Hugging Yi Li in his arms, Mo Xiaoyao said hatefully, "Mo Jingqi. I will definitely make him suffer a fate worse than death. Yili smiled and patted his shoulder, softly saying, "No matter what you do, I and everyone in the Mahist army will support you." After resting for a while and seeing that Imo Xiaoyao had calmed down a lot, Yili asked, "Xiaoyao, do you have any plans in mind? Nowadays, there are a lot of things happening in the Northwest. Recently, there have been several generations of passers-by that have entered the Northwest. I'm afraid that the area around Hong Province has been turned upside down by those people. Unfortunately, these people didn't know that entering the Emperor Gaozu's mausoleum from the Northwest was simply wishful thinking. Unless they forcefully dug up the mausoleum, even if Tan Jiji came, he could only take a detour. Nowadays, in the Northwest, apart from the Mahist army, who would dare to dig up the mausoleum with great fanfare? Of course, the Mahist army wouldn't dig up the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu's mausoleum. Although the previous dynasty had already perished, the previous dynasty's Emperor Gaozu was still a great hero passed down to future generations. Moreover, digging up a grave, no matter whose grave it was, the reputation wouldn't be good. In any case, the imperial mausoleum was in the Northwest, not too far from Ruyang City. Apart from Tan Jiji and Dr. Lin, no one knew what was inside better than Yi Li. Since it's there, it couldn't run, she naturally wouldn't be in a hurry. Mo Xiaoyao sneered. Since Mo Jingqi is so impatient, this king naturally has to give him a big gift. I Xiaoyao's the Emperor Gaozu's, I ts shows t's, s, ssss, s. Sts. T's to ttts's sts father s father and you used to come to invite him's twos to invites twos to come s of this master st's ye. If one were to say that Mo Jingqi did not send people to monitor his grandfather and uncle, even the newborn Mo Xiaobao would not believe it. Although they had also arranged for people to protect the safety of Lishan Academy, it was impossible for Lishan Academy to not attract attention without these two people, regardless of whether they went openly or secretly. If possible, Yi Li naturally hoped to bring grandfather and eldest uncle's family to the Northwest. But with grandfather's temperament, he definitely wouldn't agree. Therefore, rashly calling them over would instead draw them into the whirlpool of battle. Mo Xiaoyao chuckled softly. A few days ago, I read the ideas you wrote about governing the Northwest. Education is indeed very important. However, the Northwest region was far away, and unlike Yunzhou, there weren't many scholars. Over the generations, there weren't many outstanding scholars. Even if we want to open an academy in the future, I'm afraid we won't be able to find a good teacher to teach us. We'll have to ask Mr. Qingyun and Mr. Hongyu for help. Yi Li blushed slightly and said, I was just writing something randomly, if there's anything inappropriate. Mo Xiaoyao laughed and said, how could there be anything inappropriate? My Yi Li is indeed a unique and wondrous woman. Not only could he mount a horse to kill the enemy, but he could also govern the country. Compared to Li Li, those ministers of the imperial court are all useless. Yi Li felt even more embarrassed to be praised by Mo Xiaoyao so bluntly. Back then, when she had written those things, she had not thought too much about it. She had only thought that the Northwest would be a mess after the war. Neither she nor Mo Xiaoyao had any experience in governing a place. Rather than being in a mess, it was better to think about it first so that they wouldn't be caught unprepared. However, what happened next was not something Yi Li could have predicted. Fortunately, the Northwest had not suffered as much damage as she had imagined. Mo Xiaoyao had also taken down all the places other than Feihong Pass with lightning speed, easing the post-war situation in the Northwest. Hugging Yi Li, Mo Xiaoyao sat with his back against the headboard. His brows furrowed as he pondered. Actually, I still hope that Mr. Qingyun and Mr. Hongyu can come to the Northwest, as well as Lord Su and young Master Qingchen. In the future, there will be more and more things happening in the Northwest. The Prince Ding Mansion has many generals, but when it comes to governing a place, there isn't even half a person who has the talent to help the people. The Prince Ding Mansion was built on military exploits. Although the past Prince Ding had been good at both civil and military affairs, his subordinates were still generals. After all, the Prince Ding Mansion was not the imperial court. There was no need for so many civil officials to govern or participate in politics. Yili thought for a moment and said, Big Brother is now in the northwest. As long as he receives the letter, he will come to see the child. However, it won't be so easy for grandfather and uncle to leave Yunzhou. Why don't I go there myself? No. Yili was pulled back into his arms. Mo Xiaoyao rested his chin on Yili's shoulder and said in a low voice, I will personally write a letter to the old man to discuss with him about Mr. Qingyun. You are not allowed to go anywhere. Yili raised her eyebrows. This was too domineering. Before Yili could speak, Mo Xiaoyao rubbed his chin. His domineering voice immediately became very aggrieved and careful. Yili, don't go. Don't leave me. A small arrow shot into Yili's heart. Her face darkened. When did this person become so shameless? Yili. You want to leave me again? Otherwise, I will go with you wherever you go, okay? I'm afraid. If something happens to you, I will throw Mo Xiaobao away and let him become an orphan without parents. He will wander around and not know his next meal. Yili couldn't help but reach out and pinch his waist. That is your son. What kind of deep hatred do you have for him? Mo Xiaoyao didn't care about this. He grimaced in pain but still didn't change his words. It was only when he saw Yili's slightly narrowed eyes that he reluctantly stopped and asked, Yili won't abandon me? Yili sighed and said, No, I'm just saying. You and the baby are both here. Where else can I go? Only then did Mo Xiaoyao hug Yili with satisfaction. If Master Qingyun didn't come, in 2 years, he would secretly give Mo Xiaobao to him. Yili belonged to him and him alone. Looking at Mo Xiaoyao who was lazily hugging her, Yili helplessly sighed in her heart. She picked up the previous topic and continued, You mean to say that you want to hold a big celebration for the baby's 1-month-old? Mo Xiaoyao smiled and said, The birth of I's heir should be held in a big way. Don't those people want to come to the northwest to search for treasures? Rather than having them come here in secret, why don't we invite them here in the open? I want to see what kind of imperial jade seal they can find. Even if there really was an imperial jade seal, without his permission, he wanted to see who could take it away from the northwest. Chapter 444. Yili's heart skipped a beat. You're thinking of, Mo Xiaoyao gave a sinister smile, isn't it said that the one who obtains the imperial jade seal will obtain the world? Then let's see who will be able to obtain the imperial jade seal and who will be able to obtain the world. Yili lowered her brows and pondered for a moment. If the imperial jade seal were to leak out from the Prince Ding mansion, it wouldn't be a good thing. I've got it. Thinking of the bright yellow silk that she had brought out from the imperial mausoleum, Yili suddenly smiled. Looking at Mo Xiaoyao, she said, I had forgotten that I had brought out a treasure map from the imperial mausoleum. The birth of the Ding kingdom's little heir had spread throughout the world in an extremely flamboyant manner in a short period of time. Furthermore, Prince Ding had decided to hold a 1-month-old banquet for the little heir, inviting all the influential and famous people of various countries. Adding on to the news that the imperial jade seal and the previous dynasty's treasure had appeared in the northwest, countless people had rushed to the northwest of Dechu state. Chu capital Su resident Su Qingyan looked at the letter in his hand with a surprised and happy expression. Even the hand that was holding the letter couldn't help but tremble. Su Qingbai sat at the side and looked at Su Hongyan's uncontrollable excitement. He couldn't help but ask curiously, Second uncle, did something happen on second brother's side? Su Qingyan handed over the letter and said, Li Er gave birth to a boy. After training outside for a long time, Su Qingbai was obviously much more mature than before. Hearing this news, he couldn't help but have a hint of joy on his lips. In the end, Su Hongyan carefully read the letter that he handed over and smiled, This is great. Grandfather will definitely be very happy when he hears this news. Su Hongyan nodded repeatedly. Last year, after Lear had met with danger and disappeared, his father's health had become extremely poor. It wasn't easy for him to get the news that Lear was safe and sound. Now that Lear had safely given birth to a son, his father would definitely be very happy when he heard this good news that he had become a great-grandfather. The housekeeper standing at the door looked at the old master and fourth young master who had lost their composure and reminded, "Old master, fourth young master. The person who came to send you off is still waiting outside the door." Although he was also very happy that Miss Lear gave birth to a child, he still had to have the proper etiquette. He couldn't let the messenger wait there for nothing. Su Hongyan came back to his senses and nodded, "Reward. No, quickly invite the person who delivered the letter in. This old master still has some things to ask him." The head steward responded and hurriedly went out to invite him. Not long after, a young man in ordinary clothes walked in. He cupped his hands and smiled at Su Hongyan. "Lord Su, fourth young master, long time no see." Su Hongyan was taken aback. Seeing the young man raise his head and reveal his handsome face under his slightly messy hair, he couldn't help but exclaim, "Young Master Feng-san." The young man was none other than Feng Xiao, who was supposed to be in the northwest. Without waiting for Su Hongyan to invite him to take a seat, Feng Xiao walked to a chair at the side and slumped down. He let out a long sigh and complained, in order to return before the news was sent back to the capital, this young master ran 3 fine horses to death along the way. "I'm so tired." He had set out the day after the little heir was born and had only used 3 days to rush back to the capital. Compared to now, the news of the little heir's birth was still on the way. Su Hongyan was stunned and looked at Feng Xiao in a daze. It was Su Qingbai who asked, "Young Master Feng-san, other than the matter of cousin Li-er and little nephew, is there something else?" Feng Xiao jerked the corner of his mouth and forced out a smile, but it was more like a bitter smile. "If there's nothing else, how could the prince be willing to let me return to the capital to be carefree at this time? Although, returning to the capital might not be as easy as staying in the northwest." Su Hongyan also came back to his senses. Hearing Feng Xiao's words, he hurriedly asked, "Did something happen?" Feng Xiao didn't have time to ask for water. He grabbed a pot of herbal tea from the side and poured it into his mouth. Then he looked at Su Hongyan and said, "The prince and Wang Fei hope that official Su and fourth young master will leave the capital with me and head to the northwest." Su Hongyan's expression froze. He and Su Qingbai were the only members of the Su clan left in the capital. In other words, they were hostages of the court. Once they left without the emperor's permission, then the Su family and the imperial family would be completely at odds. Seeing Su Hongyan's expression, Feng Xiao knew that Su Hongyan was in a difficult position. He said in a heavy voice, "I won't hide it from official Su. The Prince Ding mansion and the court's relationship is irreversible. If official Su and fourth young master remain in the capital, I'm afraid it will be disadvantageous for you too." Su Hongyan frowned and said, "It's fine if we leave. There's only our family in the capital. But the Su clan has been in Yunzhou for 100 years. If the emperor wants to find trouble, where can't he find it?" Feng Xiao took out another letter and handed it over, saying, "This was written by the prince and Wang Fei. I have personally delivered the same letter to Mr. Qingyun in Yunzhou. But I have no time to stay in Yunzhou for long. Mr. Qingyun and Mr. Hongyu must have made a decision by now." Su Hongyu took the letter in confusion and opened it. He frowned and read it. Soon, his expression changed greatly. His usually calm face was filled with anger. After a long time, he said angrily, "Absurd. There's such a thing, the emperor actually. It's really..." Slapping the letter on the table, Su Hongyan raised his head and stared at Feng Xiao, saying, "Third young master Feng, is the letter true?" Feng Xiao smiled bitterly and said, "Does official Su think this is something that can be casually made up?" Su Hongyan was speechless. Everything in the letter was shocking. Which one of them could be casually made up? But this kind of matter was too hard to believe. Su Qingbai looked at his clearly angry second uncle. He quietly stood and walked to the table to pick up the letter on the table. He didn't read it. Even though Su Qingbai felt that he was mentally prepared, he was still frightened. The people of the imperial family, were they really this crazy? At the same time, the young Su Qingbai was extremely disappointed and angry at the person on the dragon throne and the court. He looked down, folded the letter, and gently put it back on the table. Su Qingbai laughed in a low voice and said, "Second uncle, for this, is it worth it?" His father had the talent to help the world, but could not become an official. He could only stay in Lishan Academy to teach students. His second uncle was also a true talent, but for more than a decade, he was forced to stay in the position of imperial censor and watch the intrigue in the court. The five brothers could only suppress their talents and temperaments. Yet, how long would this suppression last? Their generation or until the Su family was destroyed? No wonder his eldest brother was not willing to become an official in court. He probably already saw that this kind of life would never end. Su Hongyan gritted his teeth and did not speak. But his tightly clenched hands made it clear that he also found it difficult to calm down. The Prince Ding mansion and the imperial family were of the same bloodline. For generations, they worked hard for the Dechu state and still ended up like this. There was no need to talk about the Su family. In the Dechu state, the Su family had no other choice but to quietly die. Feng Xiao sat silently in the chair and looked at the two people in front of him. The Su family was not the only one bitterly disappointed by this matter. Even someone like Feng Xiao couldn't help but be filled with coldness and anger. Su Hongyan put away the letter and raised his head to look at Feng Xiao. Presumably, third young master Feng has other matters to attend to in the capital. Please allow me to consider for a few days before giving you a reply. Feng Xiao did indeed have many matters to attend to. He stood and nodded. Of course. After official Su has made a decision, you only need to have someone send a message to me. I still need to stay in the capital for a few more days. This matter is not urgent. I will take my leave now. Seeing Feng Xiao walk out, Su Hongyan frowned and said, "Third young master Feng." Feng Xiao turned his head. Official Su has other orders. Chapter 445. Su Hongyan sighed and said, "If it's convenient for young master Feng-san, you should go back to the Feng clan and take a look. In the past year, Master Feng has come to the Fu several times to ask about you. How can there be an overnight grudge between father and son? You have to know that the son wants to raise his family, but the father can't wait." Feng Xiao clearly didn't expect Su Hongyan to talk to him about this and was surprised. When he heard the phrase, "want to raise his family, but the father can't wait," his expression changed. The smile on his face was a bit bitter as he nodded and said, "Many thanks for Great Master Su's reminder." He was the son of a concubine in the family and had never been valued by his father. When he was young, he was almost kicked out of the family because of his unruly behavior. Last year, before he left with the army, he completely broke off relations with the family. The Feng clan had already publicly declared that the Feng clan and Feng Xiao had no relationship. Now, where could he go to see? Qingqing Lane, which had changed its owner and courtesan, was still the most famous dance and music venue in the capital. However, the once famous young master Feng-san was no longer a guest of honor in Qingqing Lane. He could only secretly enter through the back door. He pushed open a remote room in the depths of the corridor. There was already someone waiting in the room. When the other person saw Feng Xiao push open the door and enter, he raised his head and smiled. "Feng Xiao, it's rare to see you like this. It really leaves a deep impression." Young Master Feng-san had always been very ostentatious. Even on the battlefield, he still wore a red brocade robe that was dazzling. However, right now, he was wearing ordinary cotton clothes. Even his handsome face that made people raise their eyebrows had been modified a bit and became a bit mediocre. Feng Xiao gave a dissatisfied snort and looked at the cotton clothes on his body with disdain. "That's why this young master doesn't like to do these shady things. It's really too unglamorous. You just went to the Su manor." The young man was the second young master of the Ling clan, General Murong's son-in-law, Ling Haoyu. Ling Haoyu now took over all of the properties and power of the Prince Ding mansion in the Dechu state. Normally, He could only hide behind the scenes and not show off in front of people. The two most famous playful young masters of the Chu capital in the past had both disappeared without a trace. This made all the talented women of the Chu capital very disappointed. Feng Zhiyao nodded and said, "There's no need to worry about the Su family. Lord Su and fourth young master Su are both smart people. What we need to do is more troublesome. How's the investigation going? Any news?" Leng Haoyu shook his head helplessly. Mo Jingqi is extremely suspicious. No one knows the whereabouts of the sky-falling flower. I'm afraid even his mother, the Empress Dowager, doesn't know. Feng Zhiyao also sighed. It doesn't matter. The thing is always in the Chu palace. I don't believe that we won't be able to find it even if we turn the entire palace upside down. With Mo Jingqi's personality, it was impossible for such a treasure to be placed too far away from him. After thinking for a while, Feng Zhiyao said, "Let's find Taizu's posthumous edict first and settle down Lord Su and young Master Su. If we still can't find the Bai Luo flower by then, let others escort the Su family and the east and west back to the northwest. I'll stay and continue to look." Leng Haoyu raised his eyebrows and looked at him. "Prince and Wang Fei didn't intend to let you stay in the capital. Besides, I won't leave the capital in the near future. I'll look for it myself." "What are you doing in the capital?" Feng Zhiyao glared at him angrily. "I'll naturally report to Prince and Wang Fei. You have so many things to do. How long will it take you to find the sky-falling flower?" Leng Haoyu helplessly touched his nose. Did he look like someone who couldn't tell what was important and didn't know what to do first? Looking at Feng Zhiyao's motionless eyes staring at him, Leng Haoyu admitted defeat and sighed. He waved his hand and said, "As long as Wang Yi and Wang Fei agree, it's fine. I don't care about your business." Only then did Feng Zhiyao snort in satisfaction. He took the wine from the table and drank by himself. Late at night several shadows quickly flew over the palace wall and entered the palace. Since more than a month ago, the security of the Chu palace had become stricter. From time to time, groups of palace guards and eunuchs could be seen patrolling. But these didn't hinder the people who wanted to enter. Several shadows avoided the patrolling guards like ghosts and went into the depths of the palace. In the Empress's palace, Empress Hua changed out of the heavy and graceful decorations and clothes she wore during the day. She only wore a light purple gauze dress. Her beautiful hair was casually tied up with a purple jade hairpin. She sat down and was lost in thought while holding a scroll. After washing away the exquisite and gorgeous makeup, the Empress's beautiful face was less graceful and noble. It was more gentle and young. She didn't look like a mother of a 9-year-old child who was only 30 years old. She looked more like a beautiful young woman in her early 20s. A breeze suddenly blew through the half-closed window, causing the candlelight in the palace hall to sway. The Empress was startled. When she came back to her senses, she suddenly felt that there was something more in the palace hall. She suddenly turned around and saw a tall black figure standing in the corner not far away looking at her. The Empress was shocked and quickly said in unison, "Who is it?" "It's me." The man in black walked out. His handsome peach blossom eyes looked at the woman in purple under the lamp with a complicated expression. The strange and somewhat familiar voice made the Empress stunned. When she saw the man in black's face, she was completely stunned. She frowned and said, "Why are you in the palace?" Then she remembered that her exclamation just now might attract the guards and palace maids. She quickly went to the window and covered it. "You don't have to worry. No one will come." The man in black was young Master Feng San, Feng Zhiyao. The Empress breathed a sigh of relief. Looking at the handsome young man in black, she couldn't help but sigh. She turned around and poured a cup of tea. She pointed to the chair on the side and said, "Sit down and talk. Aren't you in the northwest? Why did you come back? Why are you in the palace?" Feng Zhiyao looked at the blue and white teacup in front of him and said in a low voice, "I came back on the order of the prince to do something. I also came to see you. Don't you welcome me?" His voice suddenly became a little bitter. The Empress was stunned for a moment. She smiled and said, "Why? Usually, very few people I used to know come to see me. There are only so many people coming and going in the palace." Feng Zhiao stared at her and asked, "How have you been these years?" The atmosphere in the hall was a little heavy. The Empress smiled faintly and said, "The Empress of a country, the mother of the world. What's wrong with that? Let's not talk about this. We haven't seen each other for many years." Feng Zhiao said faintly, 12 years, 11 years and 6 months. The Empress' smile was a little forced. "I didn't expect you to remember so clearly." For a moment, the two were speechless. Feng Zhiao seriously looked at the woman in front of him. Everyone said that Su Zuidi was the #1 beauty in the Chu capital. But in Feng Zhiao's eyes, he never thought that Su Zuidi was that beautiful. In his eyes, the most beautiful woman was always the one who gently helped the 9-year-old girl who was pushed to the ground and beaten by her brothers. It was she who wiped the stains on his face and told him with a smile that if he didn't want to be bullied, he had to work hard to become strong. It was she who held his hand and secretly went to the Prince Ding mansion to ask Xiaoyao to practice martial arts with him. It was also she who secretly sent people to give him medicine and money when he was sick and had no one to take care of him. From then on, in Feng Zhiao's eyes, there was only that gentle and noble woman. Unfortunately, the distance between them was too far. He was the son of a concubine of a merchant family. Even if the Feng family was one of the 4 richest merchants in the Dechu state, they couldn't compare to a family of scholars, farmers, businessmen. And she was indeed the most noble daughter of the Duhua family. Later on, the late emperor personally chose the wife of Mo Jingqi, who was still a prince at the time. Between them, even if their relationship was the most intimate, it was only him calling her sister Feng. Even if it was this name, after he turned 13, he was not willing to call her that anymore. Chapter 446. The Empress felt a bit uncomfortable being stared at by him. They really had not seen each other for 12 years. The once immature and delicate youth had now grown into a handsome man. Even she had heard of young Master Feng San's reputation in the capital, even in the palace. She still remembered that year. On the night before her wedding, it was raining heavily. That youth had dodged the heavy guards of the Hua country manor and arrived in front of her door. His face was filled with apprehension as he asked her, "Can you not marry Prince Qi?" When she shook her head, the young man's eyes, which were as bright as the stars, slowly turned dark and dull. At that time, she did not understand the youth's thoughts. She only thought that he was reluctant to part with his older sister who had taken care of him again. But when she saw the youth glance at her with disappointment and dejectedly leave, she did not know why, but her heart felt heavy and she could not help but cry. Slowly, she understood why the youth was disappointed, but they had already drifted apart. She was Prince Qi's wife and the Empress of Dechu State. He was still the Feng family's 3rd young master, but his youth was famous in the capital. In reality, perhaps it was best to never see each other. "Ah Yao, how have you been these years?" After a long time, the Empress finally broke the silence. "Don't call me Ah Yao." Feng Zhiao glared and growled. The Empress was surprised and suddenly remembered that she had also called the young Mo Xiaoyao Yao. Although the characters were different, they all sounded the same. So every time she called him Ah Yao, he would always throw a tantrum. But it seemed that she could not find another name, so she continued to call him that. Thinking of this, the Empress couldn't help but smile. Feng Zhiao clearly remembered the embarrassing events of his youth. His expression stiffened as he turned his face away. The light in the hall was a bit dim, so it was impossible to see if he was blushing. The Empress stood and said with a faint smile, "You're already this old, yet you're still throwing a tantrum? You didn't come to the palace so late just to see me. Is there something you need?" Feng Zhiao looked at her beautiful face under the light and suddenly said, "Leave with me. Leave with me." Looking at the woman in front of him who was clearly frightened, Feng Zhiao repeated in a deep voice. The Empress was shocked by his words. After a while, she recovered and shook her head. A trace of anger rose in Feng Zhiao's eyes. He gritted his teeth and said, "Why?" The Empress lowered her eyes, hiding the sadness in her eyes. She raised her eyes to look at Feng Zhiao, but there was a faint smile on her face as she said, "I am the Emperor's wife, the Empress of Dechu State. Anyone can leave, but I can't." Although she didn't have the so-called love between a man and a woman towards Mo Jingqi, she didn't feel any dissatisfaction when the previous emperor appointed their marriage. Since that was the case, whether the future was good or bad, it had nothing to do with others. She and Mo Jingqi were husband and wife, and he was the father of her daughter. She didn't love him, but she had to accompany him. In the past, she didn't understand Feng Zhiao's thoughts. Now that she understood, she couldn't go with him. Taking away the Empress of Dechu State from the Dechu Palace was not a good thing for Feng Zhiao. Feng Zhiao stared fiercely at the Empress' calm smile, almost biting his lips until they bled. The Empress looked at him and said in a quiet voice, "You're not young anymore. I heard that Princess Ding is already pregnant. You and Prince Ding are the same age, so you should have found a good girl to marry a long time ago." Yao, Jijia thanks you for coming to see me. But, don't come back in the future. The palace isn't a place where you can come and go as you please. It's not good for you or me. Feng Zhiao suddenly stood up and stared at the imperial family. Good. Good. It was my own unrequited love. I shouldn't have come to disturb the Empress' life. I'll leave now. Although he said this, his feet didn't move at all. Once he said this, Feng Zhiao's heart was filled with regret. He knew that she only said this to chase him away, not because she was afraid he would bring trouble to her. The Empress sighed softly and said, "You really have a childish temper. Go back." Feng Zhiao stared at the Empress and couldn't speak for a while. He wanted to tell the Empress what Mo Jingqi had done. He wanted to tell the Empress that Prince Ding definitely would not let go of Mo Jingqi. He wanted to beg her to leave with him. But he understood her. Even if she knew this, she would not leave with him. Because ever since she stepped onto the Qi Wang Fu's bridal sedan, her life's glory and disgrace were all tied to Mo Jingqi. Even if Mo Jingqi really became the ruler of a destroyed country, she would only accompany him to die for the country. Is it that no matter what Mo Jingqi does, you will not leave him? Feng Zhiao said coldly. The Empress paused. She was a very intelligent woman. Hearing Feng Zhiao say this, she understood that Mo Jingqi must have done something that he should not have done. A faint bitter smile rose to her lips and she said, "As the Empress, it is my fault that I cannot advise the Emperor. If something happens, I can only bear it with him. Ah Yao, leave. Don't come back. If there is a chance in the future, help me, take care of Chang'e." Feng Zhiao was silent. Although young Master Feng San was quick-witted and eloquent, he would never be a match for her. She only had to look at him indifferently, and he would not be able to say anything. After a long silence, Feng Zhiao nodded. He looked at the Empress and said, "Okay, I'm leaving, take care of yourself." Seeing Feng Zhiao quickly disappear into the night through the window, the Empress stared dazedly at the flickering candlelight in front of her. After a long time, she only gave a faint sigh. Feng Zhiao walked out of the palace gate, passed through the streets, alleys, courtyards, and pavilions of the capital, and landed in the backyard of Qingqing Lane with dew and coldness. At this time, it was already 4:00 in the morning. Even such a place of prostitution had long returned to tranquility. Feng Zhiao stepped into indulgence, kicked open the door and walked in. Leng Haoyu, who was waiting inside, was startled by him. He raised his eyebrows and asked, "What's wrong with you?" Feng Zhiao shook his head, walked to the table and sat down. He grabbed a pot of wine on the table and raised his head to pour it into his mouth. Leng Haoyu supported his chin and looked at him. He knew that he must have encountered something bad. He reached out and patted Feng Zhiao's shoulder and said, "What can't you get over it? Later, this brother will drink with you for 3 days and 3 nights until we are drunk. But now, how did you go to the palace? Did you find the whereabouts of the Biluo flower?" Feng Zhiao put down the wine pot, frowned and shook his head. Qilin's people almost turned Imo Jingqi's palace upside down, but there was not the slightest trace of it. Leng Haoyu frowned and said, "Could it be that Tan Jiji lied to us?" Feng Xiao shook his head and said, "No, the Holy Maiden of Nanjiang is still locked up in the northwest. The Crown Princess of Nanjiang and young Master Qingchen are good friends. If the Holy Maiden of Nanjiang dies, Tan Jiji's power in Nanzhao will be gone." Leng Haoyu knocked his forehead with some distress. After thinking for a while, he looked up at Feng Xiao and asked, "If we directly ask Imo Jingqi, do you think it's possible?" "Ask Imo Jingqi." Feng Xiao was stunned and looked at Leng Haoyu in confusion. Leng Haoyu shook his folding fan and said, "I'm afraid that in this world, other than Imo Jingqi himself, no one knows where he hid the Biluo flower. If we don't ask the question, what else can we do? Whether it's your time or Prince's body, they can't withstand our slow work." Feng Xiao had to admit that Leng Haoyu was right. He couldn't stay in the capital for too long. Moreover, Mr. Shen also mentioned that although Prince's body might not completely lose control in 2 years due to the effects of the phoenix tail grass, it wouldn't be too long. And now, more than a year and a half had passed. Calculating their time, they could afford to wait, but Prince's body couldn't. After pondering for a long time, Feng Xiao said, "I need to think about this carefully." "Oh right, how is the raging flame lotus in the northern tribes?" Chapter 447. Leng Haoyu said, "Since Prince was able to walk again, I think many people think that Prince's poison has been cured. They don't pay as much attention to the raging flame lotus as before. I've already arranged for people to retrieve the raging flame lotus as soon as it matures." Feng Xiao nodded. "Whether it's useful or not, it's always good to prepare more. If it's too late for the sky falling flower, Mr. Shen will definitely think of a way with the raging flame lotus." In fact, no one was too optimistic about the sky falling flower. Not to mention the time and energy needed to find the sky falling flower, the long-lost ancient prescription was also troublesome. Therefore, while Shenyang was studying the sky falling flower, he also focused on some prescriptions that could replace or temporarily restrain the poison in Prince's body. Leng Haoyu nodded seriously. Everything they were doing now was based on Prince Sting's health. If anything happened to Prince Sting, all their efforts would be in vain. This was also why the Mahist army temporarily occupied the entire northwest for so long, but the higher-ups of the Mahist army did not become more radical. Once something happened to the prince, the more they did now, the greater the blow to the Mahist army in the future. "Okay, let's do it. Just tell me how many experts you need." Leng Haoyu stood up and said. Feng Xiao only brought a part of the Shadow Guard and a dozen people from Qilin this time. Although they were all elites, there were too few of them. Feng Xiao raised his eyebrows and said with a smile, "Speaking of experts, the princess really gave me an expert before the king left. As long as he is obedient, it's not impossible to catch Imo Jingqi from the palace." "Oh?" Leng Haoyu asked curiously, "There's such an expert under the princess?" Feng Xiao smiled and said, "Mu Qingsong, one of the 4 experts in the world. Plus Qilin, do you think it's enough?" Leng Haoyu was stunned for a moment, then he clapped his hands and said with a smile, "Enough, it's more than enough. One of the top 4 masters in the world, plus the elusive Qilin. Unless Imo Jingqi's palace was impenetrable, there was no need to worry about not being able to drag him out of the palace." In the emperor's bedroom, Imo Jingqi walked in with a gloomy expression. The oppressive aura around him caused the eunuchs and palace maids behind him to lower their heads in fear, not daring to look at their master. Standing at the door, Imo Jingqi turned his head and swept a glance at the frightened crowd. He coldly and angrily said, "All of you, get out." Everyone sighed in relief and hurriedly retreated. In an instant, Imo Jingqi was the only one left in the palace. The resplendent bedchamber appeared empty and cold. Imo Jingqi stepped in and kicked over a small table with an antique vase. Then, the other things in the hall were all messed up. The palace maids and eunuchs guarding outside could only hear the clattering sounds coming from inside and knew that the emperor was smashing things again. "Eunuch! The new eunuch worriedly asked the eunuch in charge. Was it really okay for the emperor to be angry like this? The eunuch in charge was clearly used to this. He calmly said, "Guard it well. Don't ask what you shouldn't ask." Yes. The eunuch nodded as if he understood. Mo Xiaoyao. Yi Li. I will definitely kill you all. Inside the hall, Mo Jingqi, who had fiercely vented his anger, roared at the mess on the floor. Thinking of the news he received in the morning court, Mo Jingqi couldn't help but burn with anger. He even wanted to kill the person who delivered the letter. Yi Li gave birth to a child. Mo Xiaoyao actually dared to openly call him Prince Ding's heir. Prince Ding's position had long been removed by him. Mo Xiaoyao's actions were clearly going against him. He even openly sent out invitations to invite the nobles of various countries to Ruyang to attend Prince Ding's one-month-old celebration. It should be known that this was an honor that even the princes of Dechu state did not have. Mo Xiaoyao wanted to tell the world that his son was more honorable than Mo Xiaoyao's prince. Mo Xiaoyao. Mo Xiaoyao. I didn't kill you back then. That's why I raised a tiger today. Just you wait. Reporting to Your Majesty, Prime Minister Liu requests an audience. Outside the door, the eunuch carefully reported. Mo Jingqi's eyes darkened. He coldly said, "Scram in." The door was pushed open from the outside and quickly closed. Prime Minister Liu also carefully walked in. After glancing at Mo Jingqi's face, he knelt down and said, "Your humble servant greets Your Majesty." Mo Jingqi coldly snorted and asked, "Prime Minister, what do you think of this morning's memorial?" Mo Jingqi didn't tell him to rise, so Prime Minister Liu didn't dare to rise. He raised his head and said with righteous indignation, "Your Majesty, Mo Xiaoyao's actions are really treacherous. Since last year, Mo Xiaoyao has done many treacherous things. His ambition is clear. Your Majesty has forgiven him many times, but he still does things his own way and is even more arrogant and reckless. Your Majesty, please punish him severely." Prime Minister Liu's words were obviously what Mo Jingqi wanted. He slightly trembled and nodded. "You may rise." "Prime Minister, what do you think?" Prime Minister Liu thought for a moment and saluted. Mo Xiaoyao is far away in the northwest. Even if Your Majesty wants to punish him, I'm afraid it's beyond your reach. In my humble opinion, the Ding King's mansion in the capital should be immediately sealed up to show the public. In addition, the Su family in Yunzhou is the grandfather of the Ding King's mansion. They have a lot of dealings with the Ding King's mansion. Your Majesty, please issue an edict to immediately lock up the Su family in Yunzhou and confiscate their properties. Kill one as an example to others. This. Although Mo Jingqi also disliked the Su family for a long time, he still hesitated when it came to confiscating their properties. Prime Minister Liu hurriedly said, "Your Majesty, the Su family controls the most famous Lishan Academy in Dechu State. In every imperial examination, the number of candidates from Lishan Academy is even greater. Nearly half of the officials in the court are from Lishan Academy. Once the Su family defers to Mo Xiaoyao, these officials and scholars." Prime Minister Liu didn't finish his words, but the lingering sound was enough for Mo Jingqi to think. As expected, Mo Jingqi's expression changed. He nodded. "Prime Minister Liu is right. Let's leave this matter to you. Remember, don't let the people criticize you." Prime Minister Liu smiled. "Your Majesty, don't worry. The relationship between the Su family and Mo Xiaoyao is known to the world. Now that Mo Xiaoyao has acted against the Su family can't get away with it." Mo Jingqi nodded with satisfaction. "Very good. Prime Minister, you may leave." "Your Majesty, please excuse me." Seeing Prime Minister Liu leave, Mo Jingqi's mood was obviously much better. He couldn't wait to see what expression Mo Xiaoyao would have when he arrested the Su family. It was a pity that he couldn't see it in person. It was really a pity. As he was thinking, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in the back of his neck. Mo Jingqi's vision turned black, and he immediately fell into darkness. When Mo Jingqi came back to his senses, he found that he was not in the splendid bedchamber, but in an empty room. There was nothing in the room, not even a piece of furniture except the chair he was sitting on. He couldn't tell where he was at all. But there was one thing that Mo Jingqi was sure of. He was kidnapped, and now he was definitely not in the imperial palace. Mo Jingqi's heart sank. He looked down at the rope that trapped him in the chair and struggled in vain. Guards! Someone come quickly! Who dares to be so bold? Come out! Chapter 448. With a creak, the door was pushed open. Mo Jingqi's back was to the door and he could not see anything, but he could sense that someone had entered. He shouted harshly, "How dare you kidnap me? Quickly untie me. I'll spare your lives." This young master is so scared. A cold and mocking laugh came from behind him. Mo Jingqi turned to look. There were 3 men dressed in black standing behind him. They were dressed in black from head to toe. Even their faces were covered, only revealing a pair of eyes. Mo Jingqi looked again and again, but he realized that he could not tell if these people were people he knew or not. "Who are you? Do you know what the crime of kidnapping me is?" Mo Jingqi asked harshly. Feng Xiao narrowed his eyes at the man dressed in a bright yellow dragon robe. He was not bad looking. The Mo family members were all good looking. However, the aura between his brows was far from Prince Ding's. Even though he pretended to be calm, Feng Xiao could still see the fear in his eyes. He smiled thoughtfully. It was good that he was afraid. "What is the crime of kidnapping the emperor?" Feng Xiao smiled wholeheartedly at Mo Jingqi, asking, "Does the Chu state have a crime of kidnapping the emperor?" Mo Jingqi was speechless. Of course, the Chu state did not have such a crime, because no one would dare to kidnap the emperor. Impudent! Feng Xiao laughed coldly. He leaned over and placed his elbow on the back of the chair, looking down at Mo Jingqi with a smile. "Since we've invited the emperor here, we naturally know the consequences. So, it's best if your majesty does not waste words. Otherwise..." A small dagger suddenly appeared in his empty fingers. Feng Xiao carelessly slid the tip of the dagger around Mo Jingqi's neck. The cold and sharp blade immediately caused goosebumps to appear on Mo Jingqi's neck. What do you want?" Leng Haoyu, who was leaning against the wall, smiled. "Actually, it's nothing much. We just want to borrow something from your majesty." "His majesty is rich, surely he won't be so stingy." Although Leng Haoyu's words sounded very gentle, it was impossible to ignore the threat in them. Mo Jingqi quickly glanced at the knife on his neck and asked, "What do you want?" "Azure falling flower," Feng Xiao whispered. Mo Jingqi was startled. "I don't know what you're talking about." "What by Luo's words?" Feng Xiao smiled coldly and said, "I've heard that Bai Luo's words can revive the dead. I just don't know if the Bai Luo flower can be saved if I stab it down." There was a slight pain on his neck. Mo Jingqi felt something flowing down his neck. It was his blood. His heart trembling, Mo Jingqi hurriedly called out, "Wait. The blue jade falling flower has been lost for more than 100 years. Who told you that we have the blue jade falling flower?" Feng Xiao smiled and said, "There is no harm in telling the emperor this. There is a young master named Tan Jiji. I wonder if your majesty knows him." Mo Jingqi was stunned. Tan Jiji? If it was someone else, he might be able to deny it. However, Tan Jiji naturally knew him because he was the one who had given it to him. He thought that Tan Jiji had been killed by Mo Xiaoyao. Could it be? "You're Mo Xiaoyao's men." As though reading his thoughts, Feng Xiao smiled coldly. "Your majesty, don't waste your time. There are many people who know that the treasure is in your majesty's hands. Tan Jiji is still alive and is currently in the Chu capital. He's in your hands?" Feng Xiao shook his head. "Although we're also looking for him, it's enough to know the whereabouts of the Bai Luo flower." It seems that young Master Tan isn't that loyal to your majesty. According to what this one knows, young Master Tan had already reneged on returning to the capital 2 months ago. Does your majesty not know? Mo Jingqi cursed inwardly. He really didn't know. Originally, he thought that Mo Xiaoyao must have secretly killed Tan Jiji. Now, it seemed that Mo Xiaoyao had truly let him go. He was the one who refused to return. Needless to say, he must have betrayed him. Thinking of this, Mo Jingqi's heart tightened. Tan Jiji had betrayed him. Did that mean that Mo Xiaoyao already knew about that matter? I really admire your majesty. You can still be in a daze at a time like this. Feng Zhiao smiled. Speak, the whereabouts of the Bai Luo flower or your majesty's life? Even if you kill me, you can forget about escaping from the capital. Mo Jingqi said angrily. Feng Zhiao smiled. Who told you that we're in the capital right now? Even if I kill the emperor, I can still swagger into the capital and find a place to stay. The Bai Luo flower is in the palace. This one can slowly search for it. Since your majesty is so stubborn, it seems that our Dechu state needs a new emperor to ascend the throne. After speaking, without any hesitation, he raised the dagger in his hand and stabbed towards Mo Jingqi's neck. Wait! Mo Jingqi cried out in shock. Seeing the dagger dangerously close to his neck, he couldn't help but break out in a cold sweat. I'll speak. Mo Jingqi's face had long turned pale, his eyes filled with fear. The Bai Luo flower is in the Empress Palace. Feng Zhiyao was startled. His phoenix eyes narrowed as he coldly said, You would place that kind of treasure in the Empress Palace? Mo Jingqi said, It's precisely because it's a treasure that it's not eye-catching in the Empress Palace. The Bai Luo flower's appearance is like jade. 8 years ago, we decorated it and gave it to the Empress as a gift, ordering her to keep it well. That's why she definitely wouldn't use the Bai Luo flower for herself or give it to others. Feng Zhiyao stood up, saying, You better be telling the truth. We're not lying. When will you let us go? Feng Zhiyao walked towards the door. As long as we get the item, we can let you go at any time. But if there's any problem with the item, your majesty knows the consequences. Mo Jingqi said dejectedly, We know. It was definitely not a small matter for the emperor of a country to go missing in the palace in broad daylight. Needless to say, the entire capital and the imperial palace were under martial law, searching door to door. Those in the palace who knew the inside story were even more alarmed. The Empress Dowager, who had long been enjoying her life in the imperial harem and did not care about worldly affairs, also came out. The Empress and noble consort Lu were also present. The commander of the imperial guards, the chief eunuch, and Prime Minister Lu, who had been summoned by the emperor, all knelt on the ground. The Empress Dowager's face darkened as she angrily rebuked, It's been half a day, and the emperor has suddenly disappeared. What are you people doing? What's the use of the imperial family keeping you? No one dared to refute and could only beg for mercy. Among them, Prime Minister Lu felt that he was the most innocent. He had only asked to see the emperor to discuss some matters. What did the emperor's disappearance have to do with him? It was only because he was the last person the emperor saw before he disappeared. Naturally, he couldn't escape being dry-cleaned. Investigate carefully for Aijia. You must bring the emperor back safely. As for your lives, wait until the emperor comes back. The Empress Dowager ordered coldly. Everyone nodded in agreement. After venting her anger, the Empress Dowager looked at Prime Minister Lu, who was kneeling on the ground, and asked, Prime Minister, what did the emperor say to you when he last saw you? Prime Minister Lu said, Empress Dowager, they just discussed some affairs of the imperial court. There was nothing special. How could the Empress Dowager not see that Prime Minister Lu was perfunctory? Her eyes darkened as she said coldly, Tell me the details. Prime Minister Lu hesitated for a moment and said, Because of what happened in the morning court, the emperor was furious, but he didn't say anything important. He only said that they would discuss it tomorrow morning. It was not that Prime Minister Lu wanted to hide anything from the Empress Dowager, but the punishment of the Su family was top secret. As long as the emperor hadn't given an order, it couldn't be disclosed. Otherwise, the Lu family would be in trouble. Chapter 449. The Empress Dowager looked at Prime Minister Lu suspiciously. Prime Minister Lu just let her look at him calmly and sincerely. As an old fox who had been in the court all his life, how could he let others see through him when he really wanted to hide something? In the end, the Empress Dowager just waved the crowd away with annoyance. Seeing everyone leave, the mammy beside the Empress Dowager asked carefully, "Your Highness, what do you think about the Emperor?" The Empress Dowager closed her eyes to rest and said lightly, "I have already retired to the imperial harem. I don't have the time to care so much. The Empress and the courtiers will take care of these things." "Where is Prince Li now?" The mammy whispered. After Prince Li and the Emperor agreed to stop the war, he promised to come back to the capital this year to celebrate the Empress Dowager's birthday. Prince Li should be on his way now. The Empress Dowager nodded. "Very good. Send a message to Prince Li and ask him to come to the capital as soon as possible." In addition, the one Prince Li left in the capital, called Ying, isn't she pregnant? The mammy nodded. "You are right. Concubine Yi gave birth to a son for Prince Li. Now the child is almost 1 year old. Send someone to take care of her." The Empress Dowager ordered and waved her hand to let the mammy leave. Thinking of her 2 sons, the Empress Dowager's face darkened. Others said that she was lucky. In the former emperor's imperial harem, she was the only one who gave birth to 2 children. Her eldest son even became the emperor of a country, and she became the Empress Dowager because of her son. However, no one knew that her eldest son was suspicious by nature. Even his mother was on guard against her, fearing that she would threaten him with her power. If not, she could be the Empress Dowager peacefully. Why would she scheme against the emperor together with her youngest son? These years, she seemed to be very honorable in the imperial harem, but in fact, she was just good-looking. The emperor could contradict her from time to time for a favorite concubine. She could not get any power in the imperial harem. How could the Empress Dowager, who had been scheming against each other all her life and thought that she could live a smooth life from now on, be reconciled? After saying goodbye to concubine Lu, the empress returned to her palace. Her calm face showed a trace of worry and confusion. The empress waved her hand to let the mamas and maids behind her leave. Then she pushed the door open and walked into her bedroom. The empress walked into the room and looked at the quiet room in front of her. She walked to the table and sat down. Then, she said faintly, "Come out." After a while, Feng Xiao walked out from behind the curtain of the phoenix bed and looked at her quietly. The empress frowned slightly, but Feng Xiao didn't wait for her to speak. He opened his mouth and said, "I came to take something, I'll leave immediately." The empress was startled. She didn't understand and asked, "Take what?" Feng Xiao said, "Mo Jingqi gave you a white jade box 8 years ago for safekeeping." The empress pondered for a moment, then raised her head to look at him and said, "Was it you who captured the emperor?" "Yes," Feng Xiao admitted. "Do you want to call someone to arrest me?" The empress stood up and walked quickly to him. "Kidnapping the ruler of a country? Aren't you a little too daring? Now that the capital and the imperial palace have been completely sealed off, let's see how you're going to deal with the aftermath." Feng Xiao raised his eyebrows and said with a faint smile, "If I can enter, then I can naturally leave. Not to mention, Mo Jingqi's life is still in my hands." The empress angrily glared at him. She shook her head and said, "After following Prince Ding for so many years, haven't you used your brain? Do you think that everyone really wants the emperor to come back safely? I'm afraid that there are many people who want you to kill him." "I really want to kill him," Feng Xiao said hatefully. "Nonsense." The empress reprimanded in a low voice, "Kidnapping the emperor definitely wasn't Prince Ding's idea. What did you come back to do this time?" Feng Xiao paused before saying, "I'm following Wang Fei's orders to take the blue jade falling flower." "Blue jade falling flower?" The empress frowned. She didn't know much about medicine, so naturally she didn't know what the blue jade falling flower was for. She looked at Feng Zhiao in annoyance and said, "For Princess Ding to send you back, it must be something important. Can't I help you find it when you send someone to send a message? Are you only happy now that you've made such a big fuss?" Feng Zhiao gave a light snort and said, "If we don't make such a big fuss, no one will be able to find it. Mo Jingqi places great importance on the blue jade falling flower. All these years, even the person who gave it to him and his most trusted concubine Lu didn't know about it. Why would he tell you? Not to mention that if he found out that you were searching for the blue jade falling flower, you wouldn't be able to escape responsibility." The Empress gave a helpless sigh and asked, "So you already know where the blue jade falling flower is?" Feng Zhiao nodded. Mo Jingqi said that he gave it to you half a year ago. Do you still remember a white jade box? The Empress lowered her head in thought for a moment. She nodded and said, "I remember now." "Wait a moment." She turned and walked into the room. Not long after, the Empress came out holding a beautifully carved white jade box. She put the white jade box into Feng Zhiao's hands and asked, "Is this?" Feng Zhiao took the box and carefully opened it. Inside, there was a light green flower that looked like a peony. It looked like jade, but when one reached out to touch the flower petals, they could clearly feel its softness and a faint strange fragrance. This flower had been picked for a long time, but it didn't show any signs of withering. It was like a jade flower. Feng Zhiao compared the general appearance and color of the blue jade falling flower that Mr. Chen had told him. He concluded that the white jade box in front of him really did contain the legendary blue jade falling flower. The Empress said in a low voice, "Take it away. Release the Emperor as soon as possible and then return to the northwest." Feng Zhiao put away the box and looked deeply at the Empress. He said, "You really want to stay in the palace forever?" The Empress gave a faint smile and said, "If I don't stay in the palace forever, where can I go? Go quickly and be careful." Feng Zhiao stared at her. "You're not afraid that I'll kill Mo Jingqi?" The Empress shook her head and gave a faint smile. "You won't do that. If the Emperor dies now, it won't be good for the Prince Ding mansion. Even though no one has said anything yet, there must be a lot of people in the court who suspect the Prince Ding mansion. If the Emperor really doesn't come back, it doesn't matter if the Prince Ding mansion did it or not. In the end, those people will still push the blame onto Prince Ding." Feng Zhiao gave a dissatisfied grunt, but he couldn't deny that what the Empress said was true. He turned and said, "I'm leaving." The Empress nodded, "Be careful on the way." Feng Zhiao walked a few steps and then turned back with a smile. "Do you know what your Emperor did? He wants to destroy the Su family." The Empress froze. When she came back to her senses, Feng Zhiao had already disappeared. She could only sigh softly, and a bitter smile appeared on her beautiful face. With Mu Qingsang secretly escorting them, Feng Zhiao was also an expert. Even though the palace was heavily guarded, they still walked out without any danger. The two returned to the place where they hid Mo Jingqi. Leng Haoyu was sitting in the room, staring at Mo Jingqi while waiting for news. Seeing them come in, Leng Haoyu quickly got up and asked, "Did you get the thing?" Feng Zhiao raised the box in his hand and said, "I got it, but whether it's real or not, the Emperor has to personally confirm it." Chapter 450. Mo Jingqi's face was gloomy as he said, "You've already taken the item, what else do you want?" Feng Zhiao smiled and said, "I'm a very suspicious person. I heard that this jade falling flower is not only a miraculous elixir, but also a miraculous medicine for treating injuries. Just a little bit of it can immediately heal a wound. I wonder if that's true." Mo Jingqi was stunned. He stared closely at the dagger in Feng Zhiao's hand and said, "What do you want to do?" Feng Zhiao revealed a malicious smile at him and said, "Of course it's to ask your majesty to try the effects of this jade falling flower. We spent so much effort to get this item. If it turns out to be a fake, wouldn't we become a laughingstock?" Mo Jingqi gritted his teeth and said, "We guarantee that it's true." Feng Zhiao shook his head and said, "Your majesty's guarantee is worthless." The subordinate did not hesitate to stab Mo Jingqi's shoulder with the dagger. Mo Jingqi let out a blood-curdling scream, and blood immediately flowed out. Feng Zhiyao's eyes flashed with a trace of pleasure. He happily used the dagger to gesture at the jade falling flower in the white jade box and said, "How do we use this?" "Ah, it's said that it's a powder that needs to be scraped off with a knife. Such a beautiful flower is worthless if it's scraped off. Just try scraping off the bottom." Mo Jingqi quickly said, "You can't use a dagger. The jade falling flower must be preserved in a jade box to not lose its medicinal properties. Similarly, it must be cut with a jade knife." "Oh, thank you for your advice." Feng Zhiyao flipped his hand and put away the dagger. He also put the jade falling flower back into the box and said to Ling Haoyu, "Do you have any golden sore medicine? Give him some." Ling Haoyu raised his eyebrows. He silently took out the golden sore medicine and casually sprinkled some on Mo Jingqi's wound. Mo Jingqi's face was pale from the pain. He glared fiercely at Feng Zhiyao and said, "We definitely won't let you off." Feng Zhiyao sneered, "If you have the time to threaten us, you might as well think about how you're going to return to the capital. As far as I know, there are a lot of people who don't go back like you." It was said that the Empress Dowager had already sent a message to Prince Li, asking him to hurry to the capital. It seems that our emperor is also someone who is not loved by his parents. "You!" Mo Jingqi was hit where it hurt, but he couldn't do anything about it. Feng Zhiyao had no interest in paying attention to Mo Jingqi's feelings. He put away the biluo flower in satisfaction and raised his chin towards Ling Haoyu. "I'll leave him to you. There's no need to send them back in a hurry, lest we cause trouble before we leave." Ling Haoyu smiled and said, "Are you worried about me? Go about your business." Feng Zhiyao nodded. He glanced at Mo Jingqi and said with a smile, "Seeing that the emperor is so cooperative, how about I give you a piece of information for free?" Mo Jingqi looked at him coldly, clearly not believing that he would be kind enough to give him any information. Feng Zhiyao didn't mind and said with a smile, "It's information about the emperor's trusted aide, Lord Tan. It is said that Lord Tan's surname is Lin, and his name is Yuan. He is the descendant of the previous dynasty's imperial family. Your Majesty, can you guess what Lin Yuan's Yuan is? It can't be that he wishes for the emperor's longevity and unparalleled fortune, right?" After saying this, Feng Zhiyao laughed loudly and turned to leave, leaving behind Mo Jingqi whose face was green and white. Feng Zhiyao took the biluo flower and went to the place Su Zuodi had told him before she died to retrieve the imperial edict left behind by Emperor Taizu. Then, he silently disappeared from the capital. Other than those close to him, outsiders didn't even know that Feng Zhiyao had returned to the capital. Ling Haoyu didn't stand on ceremony and locked Mo Jingqi in a small dark room for 3 whole days. On the 4th day, when he heard that Prince Li was about to enter the capital, he ordered someone to cover the unconscious Mo Jingqi in a cloth bag and threw him out of the city gates while it was still stuffy in the morning. From beginning to end, Mo Jingqi didn't even know where he was tied up. Whether it was Feng Zhiyao, Ling Haoyu, or Mu Qingsong, Mo Jingqi clearly couldn't remember them. So this time, he suffered a loss for nothing. Under everyone's strange gazes, Mo Jingqi angrily returned to the palace. He didn't care about the concubines and courtiers who came to greet him and angrily issued several imperial edicts. First, arrest the rebels who dared to kidnap him, regardless of whether they died or were injured. Instead, thoroughly investigate all the courtiers who were close to Tan Jiji, as well as Tan Jiji's movements over the years, and arrest Tan Jiji. Third, search the capital's imperial censor manor, the Su family, Yunzhou's Su family, and Mount Li. Immediately lock up imperial censor Su's family and throw them into prison. The first 2 imperial edicts were reasonable, but the third one poked a hornet's nest. Prime Minister Liu took the imperial edict and just walked out of the palace gates with the officials and guards who searched the family, only to see the palace gates in an uproar. Hundreds of scholars knelt on the ground and cried out for the Su family in unison. Prime Minister Liu looked around and found that there were many people who were already officials in the imperial court. Prime Minister Liu knew that the Su family was the head of the scholars in the world, but he didn't expect that they would be so popular. The emperor's edict was issued less than an hour ago, and so many people were kneeling in front of the gate. If a few more hours passed, who knew what would happen? He couldn't help but feel jealous and resentful. Unfolding the imperial edict in his hand, Prime Minister Liu read it at the gate of the palace. However, the emperor's golden rule couldn't make these scholars bury it, and they all refuted it. In fact, it was not that these scholars were fickle, but that the emperor's edict was really difficult to convince the public. It didn't clearly state what the Su family had done, nor did it say who had done it. Originally, it didn't matter whether the emperor's edict could convince the public, because not many people dared to issue the emperor's edict. But the bad thing was that the Su family's influence was too great. The Su family had produced many great scholars in the past generations. Although they couldn't be called great teachers, they could be said to be the teachers of most scholars since the founding of the Chu state. However, scholars were a kind of very strange people. They seemed to be very weak and couldn't be lifted or carried, but sometimes the pride in their bones was surprisingly strong and stubborn. Seeing so many people kneeling in front of the palace gates, Prime Minister Liu knew that things were going to go wrong. The guards behind Prime Minister Liu also couldn't do anything. Of course, it was easy for them to deal with these scholars with their skills, but these people were not people they could casually deal with. Without the emperor's golden rule, who dared to touch so many scholars? At that time, half of the sky of the Chu state would be turned upside down. Looking at the people kneeling and kowtowing, Prime Minister Liu had no choice but to send people back to the palace to report to the emperor. Hearing the guard's report, Mo Jingqi was so angry that he almost fainted. Ignoring the injury on his shoulder, he hurried to the palace gates with noble consort Liu. People in the world were divided into scholars, farmers, businessmen, and scholars were the first. To put it bluntly, the country was governed by these scholars. If something happened to this group of people, the country wouldn't be far from being destroyed. When Mo Jingqi arrived at the palace gates, it was only half an hour, but the people at the palace gates had more than doubled from the hundreds just now, and it seemed that more people were joining in. Seeing the emperor come out, the people kneeling in front of him became more excited. They all shouted, asking the emperor to be merciful, asking the emperor to judge clearly, saying that the Su family was wronged, and so on. Mo Jingqi's weak body, which had been frightened these days, was now dizzy. You're tuning into the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.